Good morning, everyone online, and good morning, everyone in the office. Let's go ahead and get started here. Waited a couple minutes for people to log in. It looks like most have done so. We have a fairly large number of people online, so good morning to all of you who are in the internet. I know you cannot see me right now, but I'm Nigel Mbaye, Customer Success Manager and Application Engineer here at KETIV, and I am standing next to Cameron Wetton. Cameron's going to be going over Content Center within Inventor today. I helped Cameron over the last couple months figuring out what we're going to do for this. Content Center is something that we feel like is like super important for everyone to utilize in Inventor, whether or not you're using nuts, bolts, or you're just using, the same part over and over again. Cameron's going to show a lot of how it works, how to set it up, how to customize it, and how to, make sure that your entire group is using the same one, because I know that is a problem sometimes. With that, I'm going to go ahead and let Cameron take it away. If you have any questions, go ahead and type them in. I will go ahead and monitor those on the back end. But can I get a all good on the audio from anyone online? So if you want to just type yes, saying the audio is good, let me know. Nice. We're good.
Okay, great.
Yeah, you're good to go, Karen.
All right. Welcome, everyone. As Nigel said, we're going to be talking about Content Center today. And like you said, the Content Center it's a great tool. It contains thousands and thousands of parts. There might be some of you here today that have never used Content Center before. So this might be new. So this will be a great introduction to how it works. But there's probably also some of you who are familiar with it. And we're going to be getting into the nuts and bolts of how to customize it and basically everything you'll need to know. So there should be a little bit of something for everyone today. The Content Center is, like I said, a great tool with thousands and thousands of parts ready to use out of the box. And it makes sharing and reusing the parts really easy. If you've got one file, or it basically makes it so you can have one part file that's used across multiple assemblies and even across multiple designers on your team. And you don't have that file duplicated across multiple machines. And Content Center gives us the power of table-driven iParts, if you're familiar with those. If not, don't worry, we'll talk about those as we go. But it gives us the power of those iParts. But it's even better. I think it's even better than iParts because it doesn't come with, iParts come with a lot of headaches, management baggage, if you will. And the Content Center actually doesn't have any of that. It makes it a lot easier to use. And I think it's a great tool. I love using it. And I'm excited to talk to you about it today and show you how to use it. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. First of all, we're going to talk about how the Content Center works, really try and get into understanding at a fundamental level how the Content Center is designed to work, what the workflow is, how you access it, how it's organized, and where all of your files go. And we'll talk about how you get it set up so that you can start using it if you haven't already. We'll help you get your libraries installed in the right place and get your project files set up and configured so that Inventor can see the Content Center files. And you'll know where everything's going to be ending up. Next, we'll go into how to use the Content Center, how to place parts. We'll learn the user interface and all the different tools that you'll find in that user interface, and the different tools you'll have after you place a part to swap them out with different parts of different size or different type. After that, we'll get into how to customize the Content Center. The first thing we'll talk about is how to plan out your customization. And then we'll talk about how to create a custom library. And then how to copy existing content. And then after that, we'll talk about how to create new content. And then finally, we'll finish with how to, once you've got your custom content created, how to update it and modify it, okay? So our objective at the end of this is for you to walk away with not knowing how the content center works, understand the best ways to use it, and you'll have the knowledge to begin creating and customizing your own content. Okay, those are our goals. So let's just jump right in. I'm going to pull up Inventor here, and we're going to talk about how Content Center works, how you can. I think it's important to have a fundamental understanding of what the Content Center is, what its different elements are, how it works, and where your files are going as you work through the workflow. I think if you take the time to get an understanding of this fundamental of how it works, then I think you're going to be really well suited to being able to troubleshoot any problems that come up. You'll have a great foundation to be able to create your own custom content. Anyway, I just think it's really important. So we're going to go over some of the fundamentals of how Content Center works, okay? So I'm going to start a brand new assembly here. And on my Assemble tab, I'm going to go over here to Place from Content Center. And the majority of the time, this is how you're going to be interacting with Content Center, is through this placement browser. So we're going to spend a bit of time talking about what you'll see here and how all of that works. All right, so you'll see it's got laid out on the left here is a tree of what, it's kind of similar to what you might see in Windows Explorer where you've got your folders on the left. But this is going to be your first introduction to specific Content Center terminology. There's specific ways to refer to things in Content Center. And so we're going to kind of learn the lingo of what we're talking about. So we don't call these folders in Content Center, they're called categories, okay? And you'll see that in the little title bar up there. This is category view. So each of these categories, if I select one, you can see what it contains. These are just other subcategories. Some of the categories have these, and these look like parts, but these aren't actually parts. We don't call them parts, we call them families. Okay, these are Content Center families. Basically what they are, the reason we call them families is it's not just a single part, it's actually representing a whole bunch of parts that are all very similar to each other, okay? So they're families of parts. When I select one of these families, you'll see down here at the bottom, I've got this other little window down here, and we call this the family table. And this basically is a representation of all of the parts that can be created from this Content Center family. You can see it's got listed out a whole bunch of different columns. We'll go into more detail on those columns later, what they mean, what the different types are. But you'll see they're also listed out in rows. And basically, each row represents a unique part that can be generated from this family. So there's one part per row. You can see this family contains quite a few rows. A bunch of different parts can be created from this family. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is that nowhere inside of here are there any part files. And I mean like IPT files, right? That's the file extension for an Inventor part file, IPT. There are no IPTs in here anywhere. What we're seeing is essentially a database of information that can be used to generate part files. And that's an important thing to remember about how the Content Center works, is that there are no part files here. Those part files get created on demand when you place them into an assembly. Then the part file is generated. And so So basically what we're seeing in here, the family is kind of like the basic unit inside of the Content Center library. And it consists of two different things. One is the family table, which you can see represented down below. And if you don't see this on your Content Center, this is actually a little window element that you can toggle on and off. Up here, you can click that table view. So if this is what you see, just go up here and click on table view, and then that'll turn that table view on so you can actually see what's inside that family table. But each family consists of a table and a template. And a template is basically all of the feature information that an inventor needs to know how to create that actual part, right? This table contains a whole bunch of different dimensions, but in order to know exactly what, so it's got a groove width, right? So it's somewhere in that family template, there's a feature for some kind of groove, right? And so that's important to remember, that every family contains a table and a template, okay? And we'll talk more about both of those in more detail later. And like I said, parts are created on demand. When you actually go to place a part, then it creates the file. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll go ahead and place a hex bolt. So I can double click on that, or I can hit OK once I've selected a family. Then it pulls up this placement dialog, and it's just got a little thumbnail. And these three columns, if you will, here, these are called keys or key columns. And basically they are what are necessary to define one part as unique from another part. Okay, so you can actually see the table once you're in here. If you click over to table view, then you actually can see that entire table again. You'll see some of these columns are red, and those are basically Inventor's way of indicating to us which ones are the key columns. So I've got thread diameter, thread type, and nominal length. If I switch back over to the select tab, you'll see those are the three columns I have here: thread diameter, nominal length, and thread type. And we'll talk some more about those in detail later and the rest of this dialog. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and drop the part in. And right now, you'll see there's a little bit of a lag there. Inventor's thinking. What it's actually doing is creating that part. It's generating that IPT file, which did not exist until just now. And I actually place it into my assembly, and now I've got an actual IPT file. And I can look at the iProperties of that part and see this is the name of the file that was created and where it's located. Okay. I would say as a user, if you're just placing Content Center files and that's all you really ever do to interact with the Content Center, then you're probably not going to care too much about what the files are called or where they're located. That stuff kind of, once we get Content Center set up and working the way it's supposed to, that kind of stuff just happens automatically in the background. And as a user, you don't necessarily have to worry about it. But as an administrator or a Content Center editor, which by the end of today, hopefully you guys will have the knowledge necessary to be Content Center editors. You do have to pay attention to what their files are named and where they're going to be stored. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. We're going to go take a look at that on my local folder. So you see that's on my C drive, and it's just stored in a folder on my C drive. Paste that there. There we go. Okay, you can see this folder contains 11 different parts. Let me pull up, go back into here. You can see this family, the hex bolt inch family, has 1,181 rows. There's a lot of part files that can be generated from this one family. Now, I obviously don't have that many in this folder, right? So these all of these parts in that family don't exist as parts yet. I've only got 11 of them. That's because I've only ever placed 11 different parts from that family. So those are the ones that have been generated. All the rest of them haven't been generated yet because I've never placed them. But they would be as soon as I did, right? Okay. So that's kind of the basic way that Content Center is set up. That's kind of the low level workflow of what's going on. You've got your Content Center library, which we can see here, which contains all of our categories and our families, but it doesn't contain any IPT files, right? And those IPT files get generated when we place them, and they get stored on a local folder. Well, on a folder. We'll talk a little bit more about whether we do local or not, but that's the gist. Do we have any questions on that so far? Nigel?
No, the only question that came through is whether or not this is being recorded. I know that this webinar is happening during work hours. I know you guys, some people in the office took some time out of their workday to come in and watch this. I know some of you probably could not attend the whole thing, or some of you couldn't just attend the period, but maybe you have colleagues who are in meetings all day and stuff. So this is being recorded. It is available to our KETIV Streamline customers and my people. Those of you who are online, if you do have KETIV Streamline, which I think is almost all of you, it is available after the class. Just go ahead and message myself, Cameron, or Brian, I guess, and we'll make sure we get this recording to you. Probably it'll be ready to go sometime next week. We have to fix it. So,
okay,
that's it.
Great, thanks. Okay, so now we've got an overview of how the Content Center works, essentially. Let's talk a little bit about getting it set up. Some of you may already have the Content Center set up and are using it, and that's great. Some of you may not have that, so we're going to talk about that today, how to get it set up and to set it up well so that it's working the way it's supposed to. The first thing you want to do when you're setting up a Content Center is you have to decide if you're going to work in a shared environment, have a shared library, or you're going to be working in a standalone environment, okay? With a standalone environment, basically all of the files that are involved with Content Center are local to your hard drive. And that's going to include the library itself, which I guess I haven't really talked about yet. The library itself is actually a file, a database file that's stored. And I'll show you that in a minute, where that is and what it looks like. But it's actually just a file that contains all the information that goes into this Content Center. And so that has to live somewhere. And in a standalone environment, that library would be living in a folder on your hard drive somewhere. And so, and not only the library, but also whenever you go to actually place parts from the Content Center and it generates those actual IPT files, those are going to be in a folder on your hard drive somewhere as well, right? So everything's just contained on your local workspace. In a shared environment, you can have you basically are going to have some folder that multiple users have access to, right? So either that's going to be like a shared network folder on your network server somewhere, or it could be a vault setup, right? And for a shared setup, you can have the actual library, the file that I talked about, that database library file, could be in a shared location, so everyone's looking at the same Content Center library database. Or you could have that local and just have the actual IPT files that get generated, have those be in a shared location. So yeah, so there's kind of the two things that can be either shared or local. There's the library itself, and then the IPT files that get generated, right? And which you choose to use, whether you're doing shared or standalone, is going to depend on your organization, how you guys are set up. I mean, if it's just you, then it makes sense to just be standalone, right? But if you've got more than one user, then you really ought to consider doing a shared environment. You still could do standalone, so it's going to depend on your organization, how you guys are set up, what you want to do. So I'm just going to talk about a few things to consider. There's pros and cons to each approach. So for a standalone environment, again, all your files are going to be local, and any control over those files, the library itself and the IPT files that get generated, are going to be controlled at the user level, right? If they're local, then the user is the one who has control over those files. That can be either a good thing or a bad thing. And if there's any changes, like I said, we're going to be talking about actually customizing this content center later. And so when you actually go to make changes to your content center files, then you're going to have to make some updates to the files that you have. And in a standalone environment, those updates are controlled, again, at the user level. And if you have a multi-user environment, you have more than one designer, if you're going to use a standalone setup, one thing to consider is that all of these common files are basically going to get duplicated, right? So if user Dave, he goes and places a 5/8 bolt into one of his assemblies, and then user named Michelle goes and places that same 5/8 bolt in her assembly. Basically, because they're in a standalone environment, they're basically duplicating those files, right? They're both using the same one, but they've both got a copy of it. So all your files are going to be duplicated, and that's just something to think about with a standalone environment. Now, for a shared environment, like I said, you can use a shared network folder. I know a lot of people use that. Or if you've got a vault, then you'll be using the vault to handle and control your content center. And in a shared environment, your control of all your files is going to be handled. It really needs to be handled at like an administrator level, like one person or maybe a small team of people is going to be in charge of handling your content center, making changes, rolling those changes out to the users, because you don't want to have, you know, if Dave makes a change to this content center file and Michelle makes a different change and they don't really talk to each other, you're going to have conflicts and things are going to get overwritten. Basically, there's too many cooks in the kitchen. You don't want that. You definitely want to have some kind of administration set up. An advantage, I think it's an advantage of a shared environment. Your common files that are used by multiple designers don't get duplicated. Basically, when someone places a bolt, Dave places a bolt, Michelle needs that same bolt, it's going to look and see that bolt's already been placed by Dave, so it's just going to use that. It's not going to place another one and duplicate that. Okay. And I think this is an advantage also, any updates that are, when you go to customize your content and you do something new, any updates are going to be pushed automatically because everyone's sharing the same library basically. So as soon as you make a change to that, it's available to everyone. Okay. All right, so in order to use the content center, you have to actually have the libraries installed. Makes sense, right? If you were using a local content center setup, like if you're doing standalone, typically those are going to be installed with Inventor. When you install Inventor, it'll install the content center libraries as well. You do have a choice. The default is to install them. You could choose not to install them. I guess if you chose not to install them, but now you want them, what you'd have to do is basically run the Inventor installer again, and it wouldn't reinstall Inventor. It would know that you have Inventor already installed, but you could choose to go add and remove features and then go in and add in the content center files, and it'll install those for you. So if that's your situation, if you don't have the content center libraries installed, then that's how you do it. You run the installer again. And those get stored. Let's go ahead and take a look at where those libraries end up. So I'm going to go into Tools, Application Options. And if I go to the Content Center tab, we'll talk about these other settings later, but what we're looking at here is Access Options, right? So there's basically two ways to access your Content Center libraries. The first one is Inventor Desktop Content. That's basically the standalone setup that I was talking about earlier, where the Content Center libraries are on your C drive somewhere, right? And so this is actually the default folder they get to installed to. C program data, Inventor version, etc. Copy that. We'll go take a look at that in Windows Explorer so you can see what that looks like. Okay, so these are the actual Content Center library files. IDCL is the extension on those. And you'll see there's more than one. There's not just a single one. Most of these are ones that get installed with Inventor, like ANSI, DIN, Feature, most of these other ones. There's a couple of custom ones down here. We'll talk about those later. But this is basically what you get, is all the ANSI part files that are in the Content Center, not the part files, excuse me, like the families and parts are contained in this database. Anyway, so this is where they end up if you're using desktop content. And this is where you tell Inventor where to look for those. I would say if you're using desktop content, then this standard location is just fine. I don't see any reason to move that someplace else. You can see I've just left mine there. So that's just a fine place to do it. If you are using a shared environment though, then you would want to put this someplace where other people can see it. Right now, this is just on my hard drive. Nobody else is going to be able to see that. So if you're going to be using like a shared network folder, you would have to point Inventor to that folder. Well, first you'd have to install those files in that network folder, which what you would do is basically just go to that folder, that default folder where they got installed, copy those IDCLs and paste them in your network folder. And that's basically all you need to do to install the Content Center libraries. And then you'd have to come in here into application options and tell Inventor where it can find those files on your network folder. So you specify your network folder here. Okay, and then you would also have to do that for each other user that's going to be looking and using those Content Center libraries. You have to tell their Inventor where to look on the network. And if you're using Vault, then basically what you do is you just click on Autodesk Vault Server, and that's really all you need to do. Where Inventor looks for it is basically handled with your Vault login. You're going to log in as a user, and you're going to tell it which server to look for your Vault, and that's where it knows where to find the Content Center files. Now, if you're going to be installing and setting up a Vault Content Center, then the Content Center library files do not get installed by default. You actually have to go and install them on the Vault server. So what you do is you can download the Content Center library files from Autodesk. In fact, I'm just kind of show you what you do. You basically just Google Vault Content Center download. And it's going to be different depending on what version you're using. So you want to make sure you get the right version. So for 2019 is what I'm using. And here you go. So there's a download for each different library. It's basically an installer. You download that and run it. You have to do this on your Vault server. So you actually have to log into your Vault server, make sure you download the files and run the installer there. And then it'll install it on your Vault server. Okay, I'll show you what that will look like. Once you're on your Vault server, you're going to go to the Autodesk Data Management console. Got to run it as admin. Second here. It's on my other screen, just a second here. Okay, then you log in as Vault Administrator. You do have to have either be the Vault Administrator or have your Vault Administrator do this part. So you can log into the Autodesk Data Management Console, and you'll see under Libraries, this is where the Content Center libraries get installed. Okay. These are the ones that I've got installed, ANSI, DIN, etc. And when you run the installer, it'll go ahead and attach those libraries. So that's basically all you have to do is run the installer and make sure that they're where they're supposed to be. Now, once they're there, they're available for anyone for any user, when they go into their Inventor application options, they want to set that to Autodesk Vault Server. And then when they log into the Vault, Inventor will be able to see those Content Center libraries and access them. Okay, so once you've got your access pointed correctly, whether you're doing desktop content or Vault Server, the next thing you want to do to set up your Content Center is to go set up the Inventor project file. Now, if you're whether you're using Inventor desktop content or the Vault Server, there's going to be a slightly different setup involved. I'm going to show you how to set it up with desktop content first, and then we'll come back and I'll show you what's different with the Vault setup. Okay, so I've got it set to Inventor desktop content. I'm going to go to my Get Started tab, go to Projects, and this is my project file that I'm using. So I want to make sure I've got that selected. Then I'm going to go down to this button right here, Configure Content Center Libraries. Okay, you click on that, and this is going to show me which access option I've got set. Inventor desktop content. It's going to show me the location of the libraries, and it's going to show me a list of all the different libraries that it found in that location. And you actually have the choice to choose. You can choose which libraries are actually available, are accessible. Even though I've got all of these libraries installed, you can see that I don't actually have all of them selected to use. And there's a good reason for doing this. Even though I've got all these libraries installed, I don't necessarily want to have all of them in use and accessible, because every time you launch the Content Center, whether it's Place from Content Center or the Content Center editor that we'll talk about later, basically Inventor has to go, it looks at the project file and says, okay, which libraries are accessible, looks at this list, and if I've got them all checked, then it's going to go through there and it's going to load every single one of those libraries every time I access the Content Center. And it takes longer. The more you have in there, the longer it's going to take to load that up. And yeah, it may only take like an extra second or two if you've got them all loaded, but it does that every time you access a Content Center command. So it adds up over time. So I would say you really ought to just narrow it down to the ones you know you're going to use. And that's why I've only got a few selected. I've got ANSI, Feature, and Route System, because I know those are the ones I'm going to be using. If you don't know which ones that you want to use, then it's worth taking a little bit of time to just go through here and maybe just check one at a time and open it up and take a look and see what's in that library. Browse around, see if there's stuff in there that you're going to need. Chances are you're not going to, I don't know who would ever need all of them. Because honestly, most of the stuff that's in there is basically just the same stuff that's in the other libraries, but it's got a different identification. Because you'll see these are broken out by standard, like ANSI, that's the American standard. You've got ISO, your European standard, then DIN, that's your German standard. I mean, they're basically the same parts. They're just labeled differently. So I'm going to go ahead and check ISO, and we can take a look and see what that adds. So I'm going to pull up my Content Center again. And now you'll see I've got these volts listed as ISO. And I mean, unless you actually specifically need to call out ISO bolts, anyway, there's a lot of overlap. So you probably don't necessarily need to have all those loaded. You go back in, configure Content Center libraries. I'm going to uncheck the ISO, take that out of there. So something to think about. Definitely recommend just using the ones you need, and that's it. Okay, once you've got the libraries checked that you need, then you definitely want to hit save. Make sure you save that to your project file. The next thing you want to do is over here under folder options, We've told Inventor where our libraries are, but now we also have to tell Inventor when we go to actually place one of these content center files, or one of these parts, and it generates the IPT file, it's got to place that somewhere. And we have control over where that happens. And this is where you tell Inventor where that goes. Is this content center files folder option right here. Okay. Now mine is set to default. And basically what that means is there's a place in the application options where you can specify a folder, and it's kind of the default folder. And unless I say otherwise in my project file, that's the place that Inventor is going to just place the content center files for any project that I have active. Okay, so let's go take a look at that real quick. It's going to be in application options, and it's on the file tab. And about halfway down is this default content center files location. And you can choose whatever folder you want. If you're using a shared network folder, then it would make sense to have some folder on the network designated for these files to end up. I'm using a Vault setup, so I've got just a local folder on my hard drive, and we'll talk about how Vault's set up in a minute. But okay, so that's where the default application options setting is. But you could go back into my project here. You could actually set a specific folder for this project, and then if I had another project file, it could have its own folder pointing to a different location. So each project could be directing its content center files to different folders. I don't know why you would want to do that. I think it's best practice to, you would want to reuse these files. They're standard library files, so it makes sense to reuse them. So I would, even if I was using multiple IPJ, multiple project files, I would point them all to the same content center files location. So I'm using the same content center files regardless of what project I'm working on. Okay. Okay, so once you've got your content center files location set, if you changed it, you'd want to make sure you hit save.
And just reiterate to Cameron, this is not to be confused as to where the actual databases are located. This is where Content Center places the actual part files when they're generated. A lot of people always ask me, it's like, why does the project file say something? But I said it's vaulted. So why am I selecting a folder, right? This here in the project file, what is highlighted in the project file, denotes where the part files get placed. The two application option settings, right? One is for where the part gets placed default, which is where this is pointing to. And then the other one is where the databases are located, whether or not that's your vault or your local folder or a network drive. Cameron can go over that real quick.
So there's two different locations we've been talking about, right? This is that one that I was just talking about. And then there's this location right here, right? So those are the two that Nigel's talking about.
Yep, and so this one that's highlighted right now, that's where the libraries are located, the actual databases, where all those tables come from, not the actual IPT files.
Right. Perfect. Okay, so that's how you would set up if you're using Inventor desktop content, whether that's truly local or if you're using a shared network folder, that's what you'd set up. If you're using Vault, then let me go ahead and switch over. This is just a message you'll get. It's just kind of a generic message. Every time you switch between the two, it's going to say, hey, next time you access Content Center, it's going to look in a different place. Make sure the stuff is there that it needs to find. So I'm going to set that to Vault Server. And get started, go back to my project. Now, if you're using Vault, like I said, you got to make sure your Content Center libraries are installed on your Vault server. Once they're there, Inventor should be able to find them.
That leads to one of the questions that we got, Cameron, here in the chat. If you have one ADMS, hopefully everyone can hear me, because I know the microphone's going the other direction. If you have one ADMS with multiple vaults on it, when you load the Content Center libraries, do those libraries get applied to all of the vaults in ADMS? believe the answer is yes.
Yeah, I think they do. Yeah, if we look, let me pull up the ADMS here. You can see, even if I had multiple vaults, they would be here. The libraries are kind of a separate thing. They're not up per vault.
Yeah, it's at the same level as vaults. So I imagine that if you have multiple vaults, if you have maybe a test vault, or you have, a different vault for maybe another location that's replicating or something along those lines, the libraries, when you load them into one ADMS, apply to, I believe, all of the vault instances. So just to answer that question.
Yeah, great. Okay. So for a vault setup, the setting up the project file is going to be pretty much the same as setting it up for Inventor content. You're going to go to configure content center libraries. Of course, you're going to make sure you're editing your actual vault project, right? Type equals vault. And this is basically the same. It's going to show a little bit different information here. Obviously, the access option, we've got it set to vault server. This is actually going to tell me the name of the server that I'm accessing. And it's going to show a list of the libraries that are available on that server. It looks a little different than what I had installed on the desktop content, right? I don't have quite as many installed, but I've got the same basic ones checked. I just want to use ANSI, feature routed systems. Once you've got that set up, you'd hit OK and then hit save. And you want to set up the folder options just the same as you need to do for desktop content. I'm just going to use my default application options setting for those files. And for a vault setup, you're going to want to point to a local folder. And then the next step is a little bit different than desktop content. You want to make sure for your vault project, you're going to want to map that folder. So you go to the vault tab, go to this access drop down, click on map folders. And if you're already using Vault, chances are your project root's already set up, your libraries, or if you have any, are already directed to the Vault. But we want to make sure that this Content Center Files folder, as defined in the project, has to know where, when I go to check these files in, where are they going to land in the Vault, right? So I've got this $ Content Center Files folder. I'm going to pull up my Vault here real quick so you can see that. Basically, just underneath the root folder, I've got a folder named Content Center Files. That's where they're going to end up. Now, I haven't ever actually checked any into the Vault here, so there's nothing in there right now, but that's where they would end up when I do check them in. Okay, so that is it. Okay, let's take a look. There's one more thing that I want to point out. Let me go to on my hard drive, the actual local location. So there's C Vault Content Center Files. Okay, this is the folder that I've had set up in my application options. You'll see that there's this ENUS folder in here, right? When we tell Inventor where to place those files that get generated, we're not telling it specifically which folder for every family, right? We're just telling it this is the folder I want, and then it's going to create its own subfolders as it goes. One of these folders that it automatically creates is this ENUS folder. You'll see that. I think it's just English US. I guess there's language-specific content center settings that it needs to create this ENUS folder. You'll always see that. And then underneath that is going to be different folders that get created as I place them. But all that happens automatically. We do have control over how these folders get created. We'll talk about that more later. But you're basically just specifying this high-level folder, saying this is where I want all my stuff, and Inventor's just going to automatically generate this stuff on the fly as needed. Okay, one thing I forgot to mention about if you're setting up your Vault project is you're going to have to check out your IPJ file from the Vault first. Check it out, make your changes to it, and then save it and check it back in. So that's and then you want to make sure that all your other users are going to get that IPJ file that you've just modified from the vault. So all the settings that you just set up are now going to be set up on their machine as well. Yeah. So I've already got, so here's my, oh, not there, right there. There's my designs.ipj file right there. I've got it checked out. Not sure why that's I, but it might actually be checked out to a different user. I'm logged into this administrator right here. Let me log in.
So the person who's going to be controlling all of this is probably one person or a group of people who your organization has denoted as the people who control Content Center. You don't want to, like Cameron mentioned earlier, you don't want to give everyone Content Center editor privileges because then you have people overwriting things, you have people not using the same standard, especially when you're creating custom Content Center libraries and when you're creating those tables. If you're not using like the same nomenclature across the board, it starts to get super messy. So it's really good to identify a person or a group of people, if your organization is large enough, to be able to control all of this. At that point, once those people are controlling it, they can create standards for your organization for how to name things, how to describe things, et cetera, et cetera. So everything is uniform across the board, as opposed to Cameron makes his own Content Center changes. He uses something different for the descriptor, where he uses like underscores and I use periods, and he uses capitals and I don't, and it starts getting super messy. And I see that a lot of times when people just, I'm going to give everyone Content Center editor privileges because everyone uses the Content Center. Probably not a great idea. Yeah. And so that Content Center person is going to have the ability to check in and out this IPJ file generally, and then once they put it in, everyone's going to do a get. Cameron,
yeah. So
right-click get. And so when you make any changes to the project files involved, this goes for people who aren't using Content Center or are using Content Center, make sure after you make those changes, if you want them to propagate across the user base, have everyone do a get. And when everyone does a get, what this does is it gets the updated version of this project file and it puts it on everyone's working folder locally. Meaning next time they open Inventor, their Inventor install is going to be referring to this particular project file that you've updated. So I see that a lot of times, like, oh, one user has this information while all of the other users don't, or there's one guy who has his folders in the wrong location, so on and so forth. Make sure everyone's doing a get. It's often overlooked, and then you've got people working on old project files, which maybe put the Content Center in a different location, and you run into issues that way. So just make sure that everyone's using the same project file, and if it changes, everyone gets that change.
Perfect. They probably will have to exit Inventor before you get the project file, because what it wants to do is it's going to overwrite the version I have on my hard drive with the one from Vault. But if it's in use, Inventor's using it right now, I've got Inventor open, it's not going to be able to do that. So to actually update this, I would want to exit Inventor, go into Vault and get this file, and then I can open Inventor again and continue working. Okay, so once we've done that, we've basically got Content Center set up and it should be ready to go, ready to use. So let's dive in to actually using the Content Center. Like I said, most of your interaction is going to be through this Place from Content Center window. So we'll want to get familiar with what we've got in here. We've got just some navigation tools, going back, forward, up a level, whatever. If you don't have your category view, that comes on by default, but if somehow you accidentally hit the X and close that, it's going to be a lot more difficult to just navigate like this than it is to have the tree. There's a button, there's a toggle for turning that tree view back on, okay? All right, and in the Content Center, we've got a search tool you can use. If you're not sure where to find something specific, then basically it's a toggle that turns on this little search bar up here at the top. It's got a lot of your, run-of-the-mill search options. You know, you can search by name of the family, description of the family, part number, material. That might be a useful one. You can even get fancy. This is like your typical search information. You can narrow by category if you want. Take some time to play with that, but it's, you know, it's basically you type in what you want to search for, and it's going to pull up a list of everything it can find that matches that criteria. So there's all my elbows across the content center. I think, yeah. So once you're in the search results, you'll see it actually move down. Instead of showing me the contents of a specific category, it moved down to the search results folder. And if you want to actually know where you can actually find what it's pulled up, you can right click and navigate to category. Then it's going to show you exactly where you can find that for future reference. Okay. And this favorites option, this little star is for favorites. That's turns on another little window you can use. And this is basically, if you find yourself using the same handful of families over and over and over again, like you're placing a whole bunch of bolts and you're basically, all you use is just the hex bolt family, then you can add that to your favorites. You just right click on it, add to favorites, it drops it over here, so you can just quickly get to those. All you got to do is just double click and it'll start placing from that family. So favorites can be really useful. I did notice when I first installed this that this favorites window was completely full of every family in the content center. It just loaded everything into favorites, which there's a reason that they do that, because the favorites are not only available here in the content center window, you can actually turn it on over here on your regular Inventor browser by going to favorites. So you could actually, I think the reason they loaded everything in there is so that you could actually get access to the content center quickly here without actually having to go open up Place from Content Center and browse around in here. But it also makes it a little bit harder to point out specific favorites. These are the families I use all the time. Because if everything's loaded into this bar off to the left, then having it favorited doesn't do you any good. You still have to browse through everything to find it. So what I did is I actually went in there and just cleared that out. Just deleted everything out of that favorites category so it was empty. So then when I go in and I find a family that I'm going to use a lot, I can right click on it and say add to favorites. And then it's just got a short list of the ones I use all the time. Makes it a little more useful for me. Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit about filters. You can see there's some filters built into here, and they're basically broken out by standard. So if you had a whole bunch of different standard libraries loaded, you could just filter it to the ANSI if you wanted. And basically what it's going to do is only show in the available families from that specific standard, if you will. You can also make your own custom filters if you want. You come into here and you just click add and you add a new filter. And if you have manufacturers, this will show you a list of all the available manufacturers in your current content. Right now, the standard out-of-the-box content doesn't have any manufacturers defined, so that's why that's empty. But as you go in and you add in your own content later, you can, one of the fields you can fill out is a manufacturer. And the reason that's useful is for filters and for searching and things like that. You can narrow it by category. Anyway, just one thing to watch out for, something that's caught me off guard quite a few times, and I know a lot of other users that I've worked with, is that if we've got this filter turned on and we forget that it's turned on, then we come in here and we look for something and we can't find it. It's just not showing up. And like I said, that's caught me off guard. You know it's supposed to be in there and you can't find it. It's because you forgot that you turned the filter on. So you just want to come in here and uncheck that. Clears that filter and turns it off. Okay, so just watch out for that. This one here is history. It's going to basically show you recently used families. And this is another place where I've been caught off guard. I I wasn't able to figure out how to turn this off. I thought it was another little toggle like the search where you could turn it on and turn it off. But really what it's doing is actually jumping down to this history node down here. So if you want to just get back to your regular categories, you just click on any category and it comes back. So, okay, refresh command is if you have someone in here who's actively customizing content, adding new content, or modifying existing content, then in order to get that to show up, you could just hit refresh and it basically goes back in and reads the latest state of the library file and loads it in here. So if you've got someone actively making changes, you can get those changes quickly. All right, so let's go ahead and place a part, and we'll talk a little bit more about what we see here. We talked a little bit about the key columns and how those are used. We talked a little bit about the table view. You can see the entire table if you need to. This can be useful if you want to, I don't know, view some of this other parameters. Like if for some reason you were looking for a bolt that had a specific head height, you could come in here and look at that head height column. You can even click on it and have it search or sort by that. So you could find a bolt with a specific head height if you needed to. And basically you can select, if you select any cell, it's basically going to select that row. And if I hit OK, that's the part that it's going to place. So that's just another way to select parts. In fact, you can see which keys it has selected here. If I move back to table view, pick another row, it's going to have a different set of keys selected. So just two different ways of selecting parts inside of here. All right, next thing we want to talk about is this guy right here, as custom or as standard. What that is, the default, as you can see, is as standard. And like I did before when I placed this bolt, it places, when it generates that file, it's going to use a standard file naming that's already set up to name that file, and it's going to dump it in my standard folder that I've defined in my application options or my project file. And then it's going to use this automatically generated folder underneath that it's going to place those files, right? And Inventor considers that folder to be a library folder, meaning that you can't go in there and modify any of those files. In fact, if we try, like if I wanted to change the color of this bolt, I want it to be blue, this is what you're going to see. There's going to be an error message that pops up, cannot modify the library file, right? Inventor says, no, that's a library folder, you're not allowed to do that. It's going to lock you out from doing that. And there's good reason for that, right? These are standard parts that are not intended to be modified. So, and you definitely don't want, like Dave places a 304 stainless bolt into his assembly, and especially if you're in a shared environment, and then Michelle decides to go in and she places that same bolt and then decides, you know what, I want that bolt to be aluminum instead. And so she just edits the file, changes it to aluminum. Sure, that's fine for her, but she just messed up everyone else who used that file. Now their assembly's got an aluminum bolt instead of a stainless steel bolt. That's bad. That's not a good situation. So Inventor tries to prevent us from doing that to each other by saying, this is a library folder, these are standard parts, don't touch them. That's what you're going to see there, right? So that's a good thing. Now, if you instead actually wanted to modify that, what you could do is place it as custom instead. And then now when I do, I go to actually place that, instead of just automatically generating that file with a standard name and in a standard folder, it's going to come up with a save as dialog and say, okay, what do you want to call it and where do you want to put it? And in this case, I could choose a folder that's not, Inventor doesn't see as a library folder, just somewhere in my project workspace. And I could give it either the standard name or I can name it something else. Test 2. Now when I actually place that bolt, it's got the name I gave it, and it's in the folder where I told it to go, right? So now I could actually go in and modify that, because it's not in a library folder anymore. Now, I would say be careful with that. In my experience, I've seen people get tempted to just say, place every single part from the content center as custom. And sure, that makes it so you can make whatever changes you want to those files, but you're also just throwing away all the power of a library. All the reusability and, you know, sure, maybe let's talk about, like, if I wanted to maybe change the description of this part. Like this is the description. This is what's going to show up on the bill of materials for any drawing that this part is in. That's not really a great description. That's not specific enough to actually tell me what that part actually is, right? Like, for instance, if I were just to tell my purchasing guy to go buy that, he's going to look at me like, are you kidding? Like, what is that? I don't know what that is. You need to give me more information. What size of bolt is it? What material is it? That kind of stuff, right? So this could definitely have a better description. And so if I place it as custom, I can go in here and type in a better description. And that's a good change, right? That's something that's actually useful, that would actually be useful to have. But if I'm just going in here and placing every part from the content center as custom and then manually changing the description, sure, that's fine for me for this project. But when I go on to the next project, I have to remember, okay, I've done this before. Which project was that in? Where did I save that? And go try and find that folder, or place it and just do it again every time. That's annoying. I mean, that's wasted time right there, and it doesn't help anyone else. You know, if Michelle needs to use that same bolt, sure, I've made a good change. I've made this description more useful, but that's on my hard drive. Not, she doesn't have access to that. So either she has to know where to go find it, where I've used it, or yeah, it's not great. It's not the right way to handle problems like that. That's where customizing the content center comes in, that we'll talk about later. That's the true solution to that particular problem. If the descriptions are not great, which they're not, then the right way to handle that is not to place it as custom and manually change it every time. The right way to handle that is to actually change the content center library itself so that it's available for everyone. Okay, so just be careful of that temptation to just, if you want to edit stuff, to just place everything as custom. You're throwing too much away by doing that. Okay. All right, another option you'll see in here is this use iMate. If you're not familiar with iMates are, let me open up a part that I've got here that has some iMates set up. Place that into my assembly. And let's see. So I know this hole that I've got set up is for a 5/8 bolt. And let's see, I'll pick a length. And I'm going to check this use iMate option. If you're not familiar with what iMates are, we're not going to go into how to set those up. That's a topic for another class. But basically what the gist is, it's half of a constraint that you can set up ahead of time, so that when it comes to time to actually put your assemblies together, if you've got your iMate set up, you can just say, when you place the part, you can tell it to use the iMate, and it's going to say, okay, I automatically know I'm supposed to go here, and the part basically constrains itself, right? And so you can have your content center file set up with iMates. So when I go to place that, it automatically knows where it's supposed to go, and it's going to create that constraint when I click enter, drops that part in, and it's automatically constrained with that iMate that I've already set up. Okay, so that's what that option's for. using iMates. Another really cool tool is this auto drop option right here. If I click on that, you'll see it's kind of pushed in, like the button's pushed in, it's toggled. So when I go to actually place a part, instead of pulling up the regular dialog where I choose from the keys to pick a size, it does this little thing where you kind of get the ghost of the part that follows your cursor around. And it's waiting for me to select some geometry, basically like where this bolt is going to be placed. And if I select the edge of that hole right there, you see what it did there? It kind of changed the size. What it's going to do is it's going to choose from all the available parts from that family and try to find one that best fits that feature. And so when I actually click it, then it's going to place that in there. You'll see that it's chosen, I think the diameter of that hole is 1 1/8, and so it chose a 1-inch bolt to fit in there. And I can adjust the length if I want by dragging this little length thing here. And you'll see it kind of tells you in that little tooltip that pops up, there's 3-inch, 2.75, 2.5, etc.
And that's grabbing stuff from the table.
Yeah.
Like it's not a free length pull that just gives you some arbitrary number as you pull it down. Every time, as you can see, it's jumping in steps based on whatever's in the table. And I know it doesn't load super fast, but I want to iterate that too. You can't just select an arbitrary number like 4.05 inches. It will have to select one that is tabletized in the table.
Yeah. Yep. Perfect. Okay. So it's got a couple other little tools here. You can access the bolted connection generator directly from here if that's what you want to do, which will let you add nuts and washers and that kind of stuff as needed. If it's picked, like let's say for instance, I've deliberately oversized this hole. I've made it 1 1/8. Inventor has done its best to guess what I want there, and it's picked a 1-inch bolt. But let's say I really actually made that hole extra big for a 7/8 bolt. Then you can just click on this change size, and then it pulls up it actually places the part in there as the one that it chose, but then it pulls up this dialog to let you change the size. So I can say, no, I actually want that to be a 7/8. And then it goes in and replaces that with the different size bolt there. Okay, so the auto drop can be a nice little tool. You can have Inventor select things for you based on the feature geometry. One thing to watch out for is this is a toggle, and this has caught me quite a few times where it'll just be on and I don't realize it, and I go to place a part and I'm expecting to see the table that I can pick from, but it just does this instead. If you want to get to the table, you can just right click and hit change size. Then it's going to pull up the table like normal. But it'll do that every time. So if you don't want that to happen every time, you just come in here and toggle off that auto drop. Okay. And the auto drop is useful for, it's available to be used for bolts, nuts, washers, and clevis pins, bearings, and circlips. It doesn't work for other things like pipe fittings and stuff like that. If you have it turned on, it's not going to do an auto drop. It'll just pull up the regular selection dialog because it doesn't work for those. Okay, so let's say I've already placed a content center part in here, but I decided that I need this bolt to actually be longer than what I've got in there. I don't have to just delete that part and then just place a new one and then reconstrain it. You know, I've already got some constraints in place. But if I deleted it, I'd have to reconstrain it. But what you can do instead is you can actually just change the size of an existing part that you've placed. And you do that by right-clicking on the part, and then you go to change size. And it's going to pull up that same selection dialog, and I can choose, I want that to be 2-inch instead. Okay, and what this is doing is it's actually replacing from the same family. So this is the heavy hex bolt inch family. You'll see this option isn't here during the normal placement, this replace all. That's if I've got a whole pattern of them here, if I actually use the pattern, I would just replace the first one and the pattern would update itself. But if I've actually placed 5 separate components in there, then I can tell it to replace all of them. I wouldn't have to go in and right click, change size on each one of those. I can click replace all. And basically what Inventor does is all of the parts in this entire assembly that are of that same size, like those identical parts, it's going to replace all of them. So you do kind of have to be careful about that. If you've got maybe some of that same size bolt someplace else and it's correct, you don't want to change that, then if you click replace all, it's going to do it anyway. So just keep that in mind. But you do that and then it basically just swaps it out and it should keep your constraints that you've already got in place so you don't have to reconstrain. Now let's say I've got, this is a hex bolt. Maybe I need to replace that with a heavy hex bolt. Again, I don't have to delete it and place a new one, but I can't just use change size because that's going to select within the existing family that I already started from. What I want to do is go to replace from Content Center. Okay, and that's basically going to pull up my Content Center window and let me go find another family. And one nice thing about that is it actually pulls up the Content Center window in the category and with the family selected that this actually the part currently is. And I find that useful because there have been times where I go to replace a part where I think it's one family, but it's actually another family. Then when I see this pop up, I'm going to see, oh, that's not the family I thought it was. So I think that's useful. But I'm going to go ahead and switch that over to a heavy hex bolt. So I'll double click that. And unfortunately, I do have to remember what that size was because this just defaults to the last place from that family. So I think I wanted that to be 7/8, right? And whatever length. This one also has the replace all option you can use. And you're going to get this generic message anytime you do a component replacement option in Inventor. Even for non-Content Center parts, whenever you do a component replace, it's just kind of a generic warning that if you replace, some constraints could be lost. Inventor will do its best to try and keep the constraints that it can. And it's usually pretty good about it, but there are times where they might get lost. In this case, it replaced just fine. My constraint is still in place. So I use those change size and replace from Content Center tools all the time. Very useful. All right, one last thing here to talk about for using the Content Center is Inventor has some tools built in that help you generate components and can speed up your workflow. Specifically, what I'm talking about is the bolted connection generator and some others there. And these tools are specifically designed to work with the Content Center, right? So the bolted connection generator, and we're not going to go into the details on these tools because they could be classes of their own. But they're specifically designed to work with Content Center. The bolted connection generator is going to pull up all the available bolts and nuts and washers and fasteners, anything that's in the fasteners category in the Content Center. Frame generator is another one. It's going to pull up, that uses parts from this structural shapes category inside of the Content Center. Another one is the shaft generator. It's going to use parts from the shaft parts category. And the tube and pipe module is going to use stuff from the tube and pipe category. So that's going to be all your pipe fittings, valves, and that kind of thing. And like I said, those tools are designed to work with Content Center. Yeah, we'll talk about that more a little bit later. But that's just something to keep in mind. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is really, I think what we're all here for is the customizing, right? Content Center is really powerful, but the real power comes in and be able to customize your content, set it up the way you need it to be set up, so the parts are useful for you. And I would say the first, before you even get started actually modifying content, it's important to make a plan. Decide ahead of time, think ahead about what you want to do and how you're going to do it, so you can make sure that you're doing things in a consistent way, keep things organized, because depending on what your needs are for content center, you could potentially end up with thousands and thousands of new parts and families, and your over time your content center, it can get quite large and can become, if you don't keep it organized, it can become really difficult to manage. You can end up with a lot of garbage, and uh, there's even potential for making serious mistakes that cost time. Um, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go, but it's important to make a plan before you start. So I would say we'll go over a few things to consider. Every organization is going to be different. Your approach to content center, what your needs are going to be different, and so there's not one right way to do all of this. So rather than just, unfortunately, I can't just stand here and tell you this is what you're supposed to do every time, right? But what I can do is I can tell you things to watch out for, and things to plan for to try to avoid potential mistakes in the future. And the first thing I would say is you need to, before you even start customizing your content, the first thing you should do is identify who is going to be modifying the content center, who your team is, right? And like Nigel was saying earlier, you don't want to just open that up to everyone, because you're just going to end up with a mess. I promise you that will not end well. So, if it's just you, fine, then that's simple. You know who it's going to be. But if you're working with a team, then you're going to want to identify just a handful of people. And I would recommend, I would say a minimum of 2 people. You could run it solo, but it's nice to have another person that you can share the workload with. And also if you're going to, when you're making your plan, you can bounce ideas off each other, brainstorm, and work together. It's going to work out a little bit better than just trying to solo it yourself. But we do want to keep it small, though. I would say no more than 5 people. Again, it depends on the size of your organization, how much work you're actually going to need to divide up. But the more and more people you have in there, the harder and harder it's going to be to make sure everyone's on the same page. And so yeah, that's why I recommend 2 to 5. These content center editors, you really do need to restrict the actual editing permissions for the content center. And if you're using Vault, the way you would do that is there's actually a specific role set up in Vault for Content Center Editor. And anyone who's not a Content Center Editor, who doesn't have that specific role, they basically can't do any kind of modification Content Center at all. They can use it all day long, but they can't modify a single thing. So Vault is nice that it handles Content Center editing permissions. If you're not using Vault, though, then I would think that probably the best way to do that would be to have some kind of a group policy or user permissions on the folder that contains your content center libraries. I don't know, Nigel, if you have any other ideas on how, if you're not using Vault, how you could restrict permissions to editors. You just restrict access to the actual library files themselves.
Yeah, you can restrict access to the library files themselves via Windows. Probably gonna need some like IT organization or IT people to help you do that. It's fairly difficult when it comes to that, because sometimes it gets really hairy with the read-write access on folders. Sometimes Vault really, or not Vault. Sometimes Inventor really doesn't like specific Microsoft folder security, depending on what it is. I've seen it become a problem for a lot of people before. But yeah, like if you have a network location and you're doing this, your best bet is to set like some Windows security setting. But probably like I would say like 90% of the people on this call today have Vault. Okay. So make sure you're all using Vault. I'm pretty sure a lot of people bought Streamline because we help manage the Vault side of things. Yeah. Meaning they probably should have Vault. So, but if you don't for some reason, or maybe I let you into this webcast or someone else did here as, you know, some freebie, then maybe it's a consideration to start using Vault. So just keep that in mind.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so in addition to using that like built-in security or permissions to restrict editing, you also need to make sure that your editors, people who are actually editing your content center, they need to be comfortable with Inventor. That's kind of a no-brainer, but you definitely have to think about that. If they're going to be the ones who are actually creating new content, so they have to, you know, they need to know how to use the tools in Inventor to actually make good content. They also, and this also seems like a no-brainer, but they need to understand how Content Center works. If they don't understand how Content Center works and they have editing permissions, then things can go wrong pretty quick. In fact, this is something that I've had personal experience with. At my last job, we had a team of Content Center editors, and it was probably around 5 people. But one of the guys didn't actually understand how Content Center worked, but he still had editing permissions. And he basically, what happened is one day he was looking in, he opened up his Content Center window, you know, place from Content Center, and he was looking in these folders and looking at all this stuff, and he decided, you know what, I don't use most of this stuff, and so, you know, I just want to like clear it out and just pare it down to the stuff that I use. And he was thinking, this is where he had the misunderstanding. He thought that what he was saying was just on his local environment. And he went in there and actually just deleted all those families and like cleared out a huge chunk of the Content Center, not realizing that he was basically screwing everyone else up. All that content just vanished in one day. Fortunately, we lucked out because he did it on such a massive scale that we noticed it immediately. And we were able, because we were using the Vault, we had our Vault backup set up to back up our custom contents in our library. We were able to restore that backup the next day, the next morning. And fortunately, nothing was lost. But, you know, if he had done it on a smaller scale and we didn't notice it right away, and our actual Content Center editors were going in there and doing legitimate work, making real changes, and we didn't notice it for a few days, we would have had to roll back to the version before he deleted it and lost all that work, and I would have had to redo it. So that could have been a disaster. Anyway, the moral of that story was make sure that the people you have assigned editor permission actually know what they're doing. They have to understand how Content Center works. So that was a fundamental misunderstanding of how that the Content Center he was seeing wasn't just him, right? It was everyone. He was looking at the library for everyone. And anyway, so that's important. I think it's also important for your team of Content Center editors to be involved in making this plan up front. Make sure everyone's involved so that everyone understands what the plan is, what the procedures are. You know, when we're creating new content, this is how we name things. This is how we set our tables up, so that everyone's on the same page. We're all doing the same thing, and that's a great way to do it. Is to have them involved in actually creating that plan. Now, if that's not an option for whatever reason, however your organization is set up, you have to at least make sure that your team of Content Center editors is committed to following whatever procedures you're going to lay out, right? That's important. Otherwise, you're going to end up with garbage. All right, so one of the first things you'll want to do after you've assembled your team is one of the things you definitely want to figure out is a naming convention for your families and your folders inside of the content center. Sorry, not folders, your categories. Yeah, define all that up front as much as you can, because that'll keep things consistent and organized in your content center. And it's also good because you're forcing people to name things in a specific way. It forces them, when they're creating new content, to think about things that they might not think about otherwise. I don't know if I have an example of what I mean by that, but you know, if we're forcing them to name something in a specific way, they have to think about what that name is going to be. They can't just say bolt. You know, they've actually got to like consider what this new content is going to be. They'll think about it ahead of time, and you'll end up with better content in the end. So define your naming convention. You'll also, the next thing you want to do is choose how your family folders are going to be set up. And what I mean by that is when you actually go to create, when you place a part from the content center and it generates that IPT and it places it in a folder. Let me pull up this. So I'm talking about these folders right here that get created, that the files, the IPT files actually end up in. You have control over what these folders are called and how they're set up. And you want to define ahead of time how you're going to do that. Don't just leave it open to whoever decides to create content that day. Otherwise, again, you'll end up with duplications, you'll end up with overriding things, and you'll end up with a mess. So this is one of the things you definitely want to define up front. Now, when it comes to folder naming and how you set up your folders, you kind of have two choices. You could, the default way that Content Center is set up is that every single family inside of the Content Center, every single one of these has its own folder. So all of the parts that get created from that family end up in a folder specifically for that family. And you can see that's how, like I said, the default Content Center is set up that way. So these folder names here, ANSI, ASME, B 18.221, whatever, that corresponds to one of these families in here. Unfortunately, the naming is not that great. The name of the folder doesn't match up with the name of the family. So I don't think that's a great system, but anyway, that's one of your options. Every family gets its own folder, right? Your other option is you could actually have some families share a folder. So you could decide that all families of a certain type end up in the same folder. For example, you could decide that every bolt family gets pointed to a folder named bolt. So whenever you place a bolt, that part's going to end up in the bolt folder. Or like for pipe flanges, you could have a flange folder, and all different types of flanges go into that folder, right? So I've had success using that method. It worked pretty well for me for quite a few years. But both methods are good. It's just going to depend on what you want to do. So you'll have to decide in your team how you want to handle that. I would definitely say don't go to the extreme end of having every file in the Content Center end up in a single folder. That's just a terrible idea because you'd end up with thousands and thousands and thousands of parts in a single folder, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of folders. So I would say that's definitely a bad option. So you really have the two. Every family gets a folder, or you decide how you're going to share folders. Yeah, that's enough said on that. Okay, the next thing you'll want to decide is you want to think about this up front and decide what kind of content you're actually going to place in your Content Center. Okay, the Content Center is a really powerful tool, and but that doesn't necessarily mean every single part you're going to create is going to go in the Content Center. Okay, you have to decide up front what kind of parts you're going to put in Content Center and what you're not going to put in Content Center. So some guidelines that I can offer on that is think about the fact, and I haven't even mentioned this yet, but Content Center can really only contain parts, not assemblies. There are no assemblies in the Content Center. It won't accept them. they can't go in there. So automatically that kind of makes it so some things can't go in the Content Center, right? No assemblies, no drawings can go in Content Center. It's basically just part files. You can also put features in there. That's one of the categories you'll see here, it's features. It's kind of like, if you're familiar with iFeatures, it's basically that, same thing as that. But that's it, parts and features. So keep that in mind. One thing I will say on that while we're on the subject is if you have a part that really is an assembly, but you're okay having it represented as a single part file. For example, like let's say you purchase a motor that, I mean, in real life, that's an assembly, right? But if you're just buying it off the shelf as a single unit, it's basically just a part to you. And you could have a part, an actual IPT file that represents that entire motor, and you could have those in your Content Center. That's fine, but they would have to actually be IPT files. You couldn't have IAM assembly files, right? So just keep that in mind. I would also say other types of parts that don't belong in the Content Center would be any parts that your company defines, meaning your company has drawings that show how these parts are built that you give to your shop floor or a fabricator or manufacturer that you're contracting to build these parts for you, and you give them a drawing that says this is how this part is made. Your company is the one that's defining how those parts are made. Those, I think, do not belong in Content Center. Mostly because, and there's two reasons for that. One is the drawings. You're going to have some drawings that go with those parts, but those drawings can't go in Content Center with the parts. So that kind of complicates things when you can't have them in the same place. But also, and I think more importantly, is that there's no revision control on parts inside of the Content Center. And you really need revision control on parts that you are controlling and defining. Okay, so that right there, that for me says, okay, parts that I'm defining that my company creates don't belong in the Content Center. So it's mostly going to be reserved for purchased parts that you buy from another company, right? Does that make sense? All right, so what does belong in Content Center? I would think that if a part makes sense as an iPart, then it is perfect for Content Center. And if you're not familiar with iParts and how those work, we're not going to go over how to create iParts in this class today. They could be their own class, but it's an essential skill to have. If you're going to be creating your own content, you need to learn how iParts work. So if you don't, then definitely take the time to learn and become familiar with iParts because they're an essential part of creating new content. And as you do that, you'll get familiar with what kind of parts make sense as an iPart and which don't. For example, if the kind of parts that are great as iParts are parts that are very similar to each other, but basically they have the same form, but they can change size. So like bolts, for example, right? You have bolts, they're all basically the same, like for a given type of bolt, like a heavy hex bolt, they're all the same part, they just change in size, right? And so you basically define the features that make up that part, and then you have a table that lists out all the different dimensions that those features can take. That's essentially what an iPart is. And so, yeah, if it makes sense to create a part that way as an iPart, then it's perfect for Content Center because that's what Content Center is. It's a table and a template, right? One final thing to consider on that is if you intend to use one of the component generators in Inventor, like bolted connection generator, frame generator, tube and pipe, then if you are creating new content for those that you intend to be used with those tools, then it's a really good idea to put them in Content Center. like for Bolted Connection Generator, I'm pretty sure that's exclusively works with Content Center, so it has to be in there. And for tube and pipe, technically you can use parts that are not in Content Center, but it just makes more sense to, if you're going to create new content for using with tube and pipe, to just put it in Content Center. That's a great place for it. Okay. Do you have any questions on any of that so far, Nigel? Okay. All right. So those are some things to consider when you're making your plan. And the last thing I'll say about that is that once you have a plan, make sure you write it down. Document what your plan is. Write out your procedures so that all of your editors know exactly what they need to do when they're creating content, so that everyone is going in the same direction, and you end up with organized, quality content. Write it down, make sure it's available, and that's all I'll say. So, okay, let's get into it. Let's actually start creating some new content. The first thing that you'll need to do is that you need to realize that the libraries that come with Inventor, all that stuff is read-only. You can't modify any of this stuff that's in here. It's all read-only. So in order to actually create new content or modify existing content, you actually have to create a new library specifically for that. That's a read-write library. So let me show you. If I go back to my project setup and go into my configure content center libraries, you'll see it's listing out all of the available libraries that I have, and you'll see that they're all set to read only. Those are all the out of the box ones that come with Inventor. They're set to read only. If I want to make new content, I have to create a library that's going to say rewrite here. And the way that you do that is going to depend on whether you're using desktop content or Vault. Okay. Since I've got it set to Vault right now, we'll start with that. I'll show you how to create it with Vault. What you want to do is you actually have to go to your Vault server and open up the ADMS console. So you will need Vault Administrator to do this. But you basically come into Libraries, you right-click on Libraries and create library, and give it a name. You can name it whatever you want. You could call it custom. You could name it after your company. Let's say that. We're going to do that here. Company name. I'll call it 1 because we're going to make another one later through desktop content. Basically, you just give it a name. The partition is basically going to be what version of Inventor this is going to work with. I happen to have 3 versions installed, so that's why I've got a choice here. But I'm working with in 2019 right now, so that's what I'll use. The database name is basically just going to be this partition and the name. It fills itself out. You don't have to change that, so I wouldn't mess with that. Just basically type in your name, make sure you're saving it to the right partition. Hit go, and then give it a second while it creates that on the server. There we go, successfully created. Now it shows it listed here, and you'll see the icon is a little bit different. If you can see that, these out-of-the-box ones that are read-only have a little padlock symbol, and the custom one has the padlock symbol unlocked and opened. So that's how you can quickly tell the difference. And also when you select on it, you can see read-write permissions that says read and write, where all these other ones are read-only. Okay, so that's basically all I have to do on the Vault server side, but I do have to edit my project file because now I've got a new library, but my Inventor doesn't know to go use that yet. So I do want to go back into my project setup, go into configure content center libraries. And again, you'll want to make sure you'll check out your Vault project before you make this change. Go in here now, I can see company name 1 is there. That's my custom library. And I go ahead and check that, make sure that's in use so I can start working with it. Hit OK, save that. And then again, my Vault project, I'll make sure I check that back in and make sure my other users do a get on that, so they get this updated version of the project. Okay, so that's how you create a custom library and access it with a Vault server setup. Let's do the desktop content. So I'm going to switch over to that. There's my warning again. And this one's going to be a little different. Obviously, we're not going to access the Vault server for this. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to go straight to our project and go to Configure Content Center Libraries. And then you'll see this one's, I had it's set up to use that one on the Vault, but it can't see that anymore since I changed my access option. I'll go ahead and uncheck that just for our purposes today. But what you want to do is go down here and hit Create Library. And then again, we're going to give it a name. Hit OK. And it automatically checks it for in use, so that's good. And then hit OK. Let's go ahead and go take a look at that. So what that did is that actually created a new IDCL file in my library's location. There it is right there, company name 2 IDCL. And it's pretty small because there's nothing in it right now. One more thing I'm going to mention on here, like if you accidentally make one and you want to delete it, you can delete it through here to hit that X button. But the reason I'm bringing it up is to be really careful about that. When I was preparing for this training, I did this several times, created a new library, and I went back in to delete it. And when I hit that delete button, like normally when you try to delete stuff, like there's going to be a confirmation that comes up and says, "Do you sure you want to delete this?" Like it didn't do that. Like it just deleted it. Blam, it was gone. So that kind of freaked me out. Like steer clear of that delete button right there, unless you actually intend to delete something, because you might actually, it's not going to ask. So anyway, all right, so I've got that set up. Save my project, and that's it. So now I should have, when I go into my content center, if I go into my place from content center, I'm not going to notice anything different, because yeah, all of the content that's in my new custom library is going to be merged in with all this other content, but since there's nothing there yet, I'm not going to notice anything. But if you're actually creating content, we're going to want to get familiar with the Content Center Editor dialog. And that can be found on the Manage tab, this Content Center panel here. You'll see the Editor button. It's going to look very similar to the Place from Content Center, but obviously there's going to be some other tools involved in customizing your content. And now you'll actually see I've got a library view that I can choose which library I'm actually looking at and working with. And so it's going to show a list of all the ones that are available to my project file. Right now it's set to merged view, so that's basically showing me what I would see in my Place from Content Center window, where everything's combined together. But if I go over to my new one, Company 2, you can see it's empty right now, right? So yeah, let's start adding some stuff to this. I would say when you are getting ready, if you've never done this before, if you're just learning and starting off customizing your own content, I would say rather than jumping into the deep end of the pool and creating some brand new content from scratch, I would say start out with taking some of the existing content that comes with Inventor and modifying that. And that'll give you a good feel for how modification works. And then you can move on. Once you've kind of you're comfortable with that, you can move on to actually creating brand new content. And that's kind of what we're going to follow today. We'll copy some of the existing content from Inventor. We'll do that first, and then we'll move on and talk about creating new custom content. So the way that works is, like as I mentioned before, the stuff that comes with Inventor, you can't modify it, you can't touch it. But if you need to be able to like change the descriptions like we were talking about earlier for some of the existing content, we definitely want to use that. We don't want to have to rebuild all that stuff from scratch. It's all there. we definitely want to use it. We just can't modify it where it's at. What we have to do is copy that content from the read-only library and copy it into our read-only or our read-write library. Then we can modify it there. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to switch over to the ANSI library, and let's see. I'm going to go to, let's work with some pipe fittings. I'm going to go into flanges. And let's say this is one of the parts that I use frequently, but the description is crap. So I want to be able to modify that. So what I'm going to do, you may have noticed this or may not, but this stuff looks a little bit different than if you were seeing it from the Place from Content Center window. It looks like the thumbnails are kind of grayed out. Normally they're a little more bold, but in here they're grayed out because the library that I'm looking at right now is a read-only library. I can't change any of that stuff. So Inventor kind of grays it out a little bit just as kind of a visual indication of that. So what I'm going to do to copy that is right-click on the family I want, and there are several different ways of copying content from the standard libraries into a custom library. And I'm not going to go into all the differences between the different types because I've been doing this for years, and all of my experience has basically led me to doing it the same way every time now. So what I recommend is using Save Copy As. I think that's the best way to go. So that's what I recommend for everyone to do. If you're interested in learning the differences between the different types of copy operations, if you just go to the Inventor help documentation, it describes the different copy operations and the differences between them. So you can read up on that if you want. But my recommendation is just use Save Copy As. So that's basically going to take that standard content and duplicate it in my custom library. And so the option here, you can choose which library you're going to copy to. You could have more than one custom library if you want. I've never really needed more than one. I guess one thing I would say about that is there is a limitation on library file size. These IDCL files, the actual library files that we've talked about, are SQL database files, and the out-of-the-box version of SQL database that installs with Inventor is called SQL Express. It's kind of like the basic free version, and it does have a limitation on database size of 4 gigabytes. So if you anticipate your custom library is going to be bigger than 4 gigabytes, then you could set up more than one library. But that would be a lot. It would be a massive library. I mean, if we look at the out-of-the-box ones, like the ANSI library, that's huge. There's hundreds of thousands of files in that. I mean, there's thousands of families, and a lot of those families have over 100 parts that could be generated from them, and it's only 1.4 gigabytes. So I don't know. In my experience, we never even got close to reaching that limit. So you're probably fine with just having a single one. I suppose if you ever did run into that limit, then you could go ahead and create a new one and continue on in that one, and that would be just fine. But anyway, so you're probably just going to be working with a single custom library, but you'd say make sure that's selected. And again, you have a choice here between 2 different types of copies to create. You can create an independent family, or you could actually create a link back to the parent family that this came from. Again, I'm not going to go into too much on what that means, because in my experience, the independent family is the way to go. I would just do that, because then you don't have to worry about if there's ever a change to the parent that's going to overwrite any changes you've made in your custom library. Okay, that's kind of what the link means. So in my experience, independent family is the way to go. So that's just what I recommend. Okay, and then the next thing to do is you want to set up the name of the family that you're going to be creating. And this is where you and your team have already sat down and planned ahead. This is how our family naming is going to go, right? This is where you put that into practice. You're going to follow your family naming convention. So I'm going to go ahead and name this, actually I'm going to call that flange, blind, RF for raised face, class 150, and then a material. That's going to be my family name. Family description is, it's useful for, this actually goes into when you place a part from the content center, and if you don't have a description already set up in the table, then it's going to use this as a description for the part. But it's not very useful because it's not going to be specific to that part. It's basically just going to be the family name. So it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier with the bolts, where it's just going to be too generic. It's just going to say bolt, right? Or just say flange. There's not enough part-specific information here that's going to be useful as a description. So when you're creating your custom content, you're basically always going to set up a description for each part in every family. So, but this is still useful for being able to search for things. So basically, usually what I'll do is I'll just kind of follow the naming of my family. But if I've got any abbreviations in my family name, then maybe I'll just instead spell them out. So if someone's not sure what that, like RF means, I can just type in raised face, and then a class 150, A15. But that's really all the thought I put into that. Just kind of follow a family name and just spell out anything that's abbreviated. All right, the next thing we're looking at is the family folder name. And again, this is one of those things you planned out ahead of time, how your folders are going to be set up and what your folder convention is going to be. If you're going to be doing every family goes into its own folder, then I would say just have the folder have the same name as the family. Makes sense. Then you don't have to worry about that. But let's say we're working with a system where multiple families go into the same folder. I'm going to have a flange folder that all my flanges are going to go into. So I'm going to go and call it that. And hit OK. And what it did is it created a copy of that family with all the name that I gave it. But I can't see it right now because my library view is set to just the Inventor ANSI standard library. So I could just switch over to my custom one, or I could, if I switch to merged view, then I'll see it. There it is right there. Or if I go to my actual custom library, then you'll see it there as well. Okay, and it automatically created the category structure of where that goes. It just followed where I copied it from the standard library into the custom library. It basically duplicated that category structure, so they end up in the same folder. And that, I would say, at least in my experience, the majority of the custom content that was created was doing basically this, taking the custom that's already created in Inventor and just reusing it, creating a copy of it. So my category structure ended up looking pretty much like what you see in the standard content. But if I needed to create something new, you can always go in and add categories. I think you can't do it in merged view. You have to do it in the, there we go, create category. So I could create a subcategory underneath that if I wanted to. In this case, I don't, but. All right, so I've created this new family, but now it's basically just a straight up copy of the original one, right? I want to actually be able to customize it. So I'm going to go in here and let's take a look at the family table. So it's basically the information that you see down here, but you can't modify any of it from that window. You have to actually open up the family table to be able to modify any of this stuff. Okay, let's talk about, there's a lot going on in here, so let's start talking about what we've got, what we can see. Across the top here, we've got listed out all of the columns that are used to define this family. And there can be several different types of columns. You can have columns that represent Inventor parameters. And these are going to usually have a unit associated with them. You can see there for O, is in inches. NU is unitless, UL. So those are representing Inventor parameters that are used to actually define the size of the features of this flange, right? So we've got O, I'm guessing is OD. You have to actually open the part to see what they mean, but another type of column, you can have columns that represent iProperties. So for example, we have a material column, which is actually going to define the actual material of the Inventor part. And part number column is going to map to the part number iProperty for these parts. So we've got property columns, parameter columns. We of course have key columns. Those are going to be the ones that are again in red. We talked about that earlier. And that's again is the column that's used to select a unique part from this entire table of parts. For this flange, it's pretty simple. There's just a single key column, which is the ND for nominal diameter, basically the size of the flange, right? That's enough to choose between all these parts. Whereas with the bolt, we had size and thread class and length were we had 3 key columns in that family, right? All right. And you can also have content center specific columns. And these are basically columns that show up in the family table, but don't necessarily show up once you place the part. They don't necessarily show up. For example, I think designation is one. Oh, that actually does map to the part. Size designation, I think, is one. Yeah, so what I'm looking at here is whether this column is mapping to an iProperty. You'll see what I was talking about earlier, part number. If I right click and go to column properties, you'll see that this is actually mapped to the Inventor iProperty for part number. So when this part gets placed and the IPT file is generated, whatever's in the cell for that particular part that I've placed, that's what's going to end up in the part number property of that part. But some of these don't actually map to an Inventor property. They're just basically useful for organizing stuff in the table. Like specifically the size designation is used to build the actual designation property. It's not easy to see for this part since there's only one key column, but usually the designation is actually kind of a concatenation of all the different keys. Let me show you what I mean. So if we go to ANSI, let's go back to our bolt family. That's bolt inch. We'll look at that family table. If I go to size designation, so this is actually taking the different key columns. So we've got thread diameter is first, and then thread type is next, and then the length. So it's basically taking all the different key columns and combining them into one. And this is useful for file naming. It's basically kind of like a unique tag for each of these parts. So really the point is you can have columns that are in here just in the content center table that don't really show up in the part themselves, but they're useful for kind of building other properties and column information as needed. Go back to my flange family here. Okay. All right, you can see some of these have black text and some of the columns have blue text. What that means is that the black text are just values that are just typed in, where the blue ones, this information is actually built from an expression or kind of like a formula of taking data from other columns and adding in text and bringing them together to build something. So the file name, for instance, if I go to the column properties for that, you'll see there's a formula here, or an expression, what they call it, that's basically type out this text here, and then you'll see the curly bracket, and then this is the name of one of the columns in the table, designation column. So it's taking the data from the designation column for that specific row and adding it on to the end of this text. And that builds a unique file name for each part. Okay, does that make sense? So anything that's blue is going to be one of those expression columns. All right, so if you want to add a column, there's some tools up here for adding columns, also for adding rows. If you want to add a row, you have to pick a row, and then I think it adds it below. Yeah, or you can right click, add row. And that's basically what you do if you wanted to add additional parts to this table. Like this table goes up to 24, I can make flanges up to 24 inches, but if I wanted bigger ones, then I could just add more rows and then make sure I fill out each of the cells to build with all the necessary information to build those additional parts. And that's how that works.
And like Cameron mentioned earlier, hopefully everyone can hear me online. There are not, like every time you add a row, you do not have to model another component, right? So as this is getting built, right, it's just using the same parameters that it used to build the other components in the table to generate the other two that Cameron has, for example, up here on the screen. I know this is like a big misunderstanding sometimes when I was going over, adding rows to content center. They're like, well, do we have to model that iteration and then put that information in Vault or the custom content center? It's like, no, you don't. It's using the same information that it used to build the rest of the files. Like we mentioned earlier, it is a database, not the actual part files. It just has the intelligence that it needs based on the parameters that are set in this table, how to build that component. So just keep that in mind.
All right, I'm going to cancel that. I don't want to add those rows. Let's go back into there. One really useful tool for working in Content Center families is you can actually, because this is just a table, you can actually modify it and work with it in Excel. If you click on the Edit via Spreadsheet button, what it's going to do is it's going to launch Excel.
And this is why Inventor needs Excel to work properly.
There it is.
For this reason.
Yeah, it's actually using Excel to manage some of this stuff. Like if you don't have Excel installed, you can't use Content Center or iPart tables or anything like that. It's part of the way Inventor functions.
Or a supported version of Excel. That's a big one too, right?
Yeah.
A couple of years ago when Excel 2016 came out, it was not supported for Inventor. So a lot of people had Excel 2016 and Inventor like 2014, 2015, and they could not access some of this stuff because they had an unsupported version of Excel. So just make sure that, that's something you use. There's a lot of people who say it's like, oh, I don't have Excel installed, but my Inventor's working. Well, Inventor installs like a portion that it needs to function. Like you don't have, if you have a full version of Excel installed, it needs to be a supported one. If you don't have Excel installed, period, Inventor will install like a widget that's big enough to do some of this stuff. So just FYI. Cool.
Thanks, Nigel. But yeah, like working in Excel, honestly, there's a lot more you can do in Excel than you can just through that table editor window. Like you could build Excel formulas to help you fill out cell values. It's easier to just copy and paste, move data around and manipulate it that way. Usually if I'm making changes to a Content Center table, unless it's just like a really simple thing, I'm going to be doing it through Excel just because I can do more here. than I can through the editor window. But you do have to have some familiarity and comfort and be comfortable with Excel to be able to do that. But you don't have to use Excel. You could do everything you need to do through the table editor window. So if you're not comfortable with Excel, don't let that stop you from using Content Center. You can still do whatever you need to do. It's just an extra tool to help you. One thing I would do though is I wouldn't add columns through Excel because there's some extra metadata behind the scenes involved with columns that doesn't show up in Excel. So if you're going to be adding columns, do that through the table editor first, and then you can open it up in Excel and your column will be there and you can put whatever data you need into it. But you can add rows through here. That's pretty straightforward. You can just insert a row. You could add additional ones on the bottom. You know, you could copy a whole chunk of them and paste it down here and then go through and change the cells that you need to make them unique. Just one thing to keep in mind if you're working in Excel, if you're using formulas to help you fill out data, then once you save this table and close Excel and go back to the table editor, those formulas are going to disappear. The data that they have placed into the cells will be there, but the formula behind that data is not going to be there next time you open Excel. The table doesn't preserve that information. So keep that in mind. Okay. I think what we'll do here, let's go ahead and modify this family. So what I want to do with this family, the whole reason that I'm copied this family so that I could customize it is that I want to change the file name, and mostly what I'm trying to get at is I need to add a more descriptive description, a more useful description, and I want to change the material. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to do a combination of working in Excel and just working in the table so you can get a feel for what's going on there. I went ahead and closed that. The window disappeared behind. Let's see if I can get it back. Crap.
Editor?
Yeah, my Content Center editor table disappeared behind that.
Is it not letting you?
I guess I can hit escape. That might work. No.
Control space M, I believe.
Yeah, I just heard that. This has happened to me before. It might even, I don't think it's on a different monitor because it was here before. It wouldn't have moved. Sometimes it vanishes though.
Just go and open it. That's the case. There it is.
There it is. Jeez. Okay. All right. Let's do the material first. So this just says steel, but I want to be a little more specific. Pipe fittings are available in many different types of materials. I need to be more specific. I do want to set this up as A105. Oh, good. I do have that material in my library. You'll see when I click the drop down, it's going to pull up a list of all of the materials that are available in my current styles library. So if I wanted to do 304, stainless steel 304, I couldn't choose that yet because I don't have that in my library. I'd have to make sure I add that to my library first so it's available to pick from here. But I do have A105, so I'm going to pick that. And then I can just copy that, Control C on that, and then Control V, and that pastes it through all of them. You'll see that it turned yellow. That basically means that this cell has been changed since I opened up this family table. So as you go through here and start changing things, you'll see things turning yellow. If I hit apply, that's actually going to save those changes to my actual family. It'll tell you that, published successfully. And then it's not yellow anymore. Basically, that change has been baked into the family. Okay, so I got material set up. Next thing I want to do is set up a description. Now there's not already a column for the description in this family. Okay, so this is the column I'm going to need to add. So I'm going to go ahead and hit add column, give it a name, and I'm not going to get fancy. I'm just going to call it what it is. Description, the data type, I have a choice. If I wanted it to be a number, like a decimal number, I'd pick real. If I wanted it to be an integer, obviously I'd pick integer. True, false would be my booleans, and then string would be anything text. So I definitely want string for my description. The column caption is what you see in the table editor here. That's going to be the name of the column as displayed, which you can have be different from what the actual name of the column is. In this case, I don't have a reason to do that, so I'm just going to give it the same as the column name. And that's good for now. I'm going to show you that. Go ahead. That adds it to my columns here. Let me show you what I mean about the name. There might be some of these here that have, if you hover over the table, it's going to show you the actual name of that column. Doesn't look like in this case there's any that are different than before, but you will encounter that even in some of the standard out-of-the-box content where what you see displayed as the column name would actually be different from the actual column name. But that might be useful if you have like parameters like this, like C1. I don't know what that is. If I wanted to actually be able to just tell from the table what that represents, C1 is the actual name of the parameter in the Inventor part file. So I don't want to go in there and mess with that and change that. But I could change the column property and just give it a new name that's a little more descriptive, more readable. So I don't know, maybe that's like the bolt circle or something. I could just say bolt circle diameter. So that's the purpose of having a different name that's different from the name. Okay, so I've got my description column. Right now it's empty, so I need to be able to set up a description for each one of these parts. So I could go through here and just type out my description for every single one of these rows, but that's going to be a waste of time. I don't want to do that. I want to take advantage of the tools that I have. So I have two choices here. I could set up an expression, set this up as an expression column, type out my text part, and then have it go grab data from one of these columns, like my designation column or my ND column or something, to pull the size information for each row in. In fact, let's do it both ways. Let's try that. We'll do this. We'll do the expression. You know what, let's do it the other way first. The other way would be to go into Excel, edit it in Excel, and I could set up a formula in there and have it write out the description for each cell through a formula. I'm going to do it that way first, and then we'll come back and do it with the expression. So I'm going to edit in Excel. Takes a second for Excel to load up. Here we go. All right, so now you can see I've got my description column in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a formula in Excel, and I'm going to type out the description that I want. Will be flange, blind, RF, class 150, and then I want to put the size for this specific row in. So I'm going to concatenate. I could use ND, size designation, or designation, doesn't really matter. Let's go ahead and use ND. Hit enter. Okay, this is one thing you're going to have to watch out for. You see, I entered my formula in there, but Excel didn't actually calculate it as a formula. It still just shows my equal sign and my little quotes and everything in there. That's because this column, basically all of these columns are formatted as text. So Excel doesn't see that as a formula. So if I want to be able to use formulas, what I have to do is select that column and then change the format to general. Then I have to go back in here, edit that cell, and then just hit enter so it forces it to calculate that. And now I've actually got the results of that formula that I put in there, right? And then I'm just going to copy that down, There's my description, unique description for each part. And it's as simple as that. I mean, you can get as fancy as you want with Excel formulas. Just keep in mind that once I save this and go out, it's going to convert that column back to text. My formula is going to vanish. So if I have to come back in and edit it again later, I'm going to have to recreate that formula. So let's go ahead and save that. And then when I have to actually be able to close Excel for it to write those changes back to the Content Center table. If for some reason like Excel crashed and I wasn't able, it wouldn't actually write those changes back to the table itself. And I lost my, there we go. Okay. Now I go back here and you'll see that description is yellow and it's put in the formula, the results of the formula. So that's, now let's do it the other way. Let's do it through an expression inside of the editor. So I'm going to right click, go to column properties. I want to check expression. That's going to open up this for use. And basically what I do is I can type whatever text I want that's just static text to show up. So I'm basically going to duplicate what I had before. Flange, blind, RF 50. And then now I want to be able to enter in, have it enter in data from one of my columns. If I know how it works, I know it's curly brackets and then the name of the column, I can go ahead and just type that in. Or if you don't want to do that, you can hit this little ellipsis button. It'll pull up a list of all the columns and I can just click, let's do ND. And it'll drop in that ND and then hit OK. And now that text should be blue. It's kind of hard to tell against the yellow background, but let's go ahead and apply that. That'll make the yellow go away. There we go. Now we can see it's got the blue text letting us know that that's from an expression. Now it looks like this is a little goofy. There's not as, I want a space between that comma and the size, and I haven't got that, so I need to go back in here, edit that. Looks like I did put a space in there, but it didn't interpret that as actually what I want in the text. So if you run into a situation like that, you basically just put your text in quotes, and anything that's inside the quotes will end up in there. So that's going to include that space. There we go. So now I've got my space in there. That turned yellow again because I've modified that. Let's see. The last thing I probably want to take care of here is I do want to make sure my file name is good and something useful. Right now it's got this copy of in here. That ended up when I actually created the copy from the original out-of-the-box content. It just automatically stuck that in there. You can control that at the time you make the copy, but I'm usually going to be doing something with the file name column anyway, so I don't bother. I'll just come in here and make sure I set it up inside my table. Now for file naming, this is where you're, this is probably something you'll want to plan out ahead of time too. You've got your family naming convention that you've set up and your folder naming convention. You'll probably want to come up with something to do with file names as well. And it could be as simple as you just follow the name of the family, plus, it can't be just the name of the family though, because that would be the same for every one of those parts. They have to be unique because Inventor is going to dump all those files into the same folder. And obviously Windows is not going to like two files with the same name. It's just going to overwrite. So they do have to be unique. So I could do the family name plus, usually what I recommend is if your company is has a part system, like an ERP system or some other part system, usually you'll have like a part numbering system that goes with that. And that part number will be unique. So you can go ahead and use the part number as the file name. That's what I would recommend. But if you don't have something like that set up already, then what I would recommend is taking the family name. Let's go ahead and do that. It's going to be flange, blind, 50, 5. So I take the family name, and then to make it unique, if the designation is there, you can use that, because what that is basically a concatenation, like we talked about, of all the different keys. And the keys are what make they're basically what identify each row as unique. But not every family has a designation. Like when we looked at both, it didn't have that designation column. It was actually called size designation. So there's some inconsistency in the out-of-the-box content there. If it doesn't have that, then basically the rule of thumb for me is, what I like to do is do the family name and then a dash and then the key 1 column, then a dash, then the key 2 column, a dash, key 3, etc. In this case, for this family, there's only a single key. So I could use the ND column. That is the key column, I think. Or I could, again, use designation. I'm going to go ahead and just use ND, just to keep it simple. Okay. So there's my file name. Those all should be unique. Another thing to keep in mind is that this has got, because my sizes have these fractions, it's got the slash in there. Windows doesn't like that as a part of a file name. So what's going to happen is it's okay, you can still leave it in here like this. What happens is when you place that, it's in Windows, actually Inventor, I think, is going to convert that slash into an underscore, which Windows is fine with. But that's just something to keep in mind. If you've got fractional sizes, which all the pipe fittings basically have fractional sizes, that's what's going to happen. You could convert it to decimal if you wanted to, if you had a column, and I've done this in the past, is I would set up a new column that call it ND decimal, and it would basically represent this same value, but just in decimal format instead of fraction. And I could use that in my file names so that the file name wouldn't change from what I set it up to be. Yeah, let's do that. So there's one thing I haven't done in the description. Right now I've set up a description to be what I want, but if I go ahead and place one of these parts, that information doesn't go anywhere because I haven't told Inventor what to do with that information. So that's when mapping comes in. So I'm going to go to column properties, and again, map to Inventor property. I want this to end up in the actual description property of my part. So this is going to show a list of all the different iProperties I can map to. I could map to a custom iProperty if I want. Then I'd have to, if I did that, I'd have to give it the name. But I'm looking for one of the out-of-the-box ones, description. So it's going to be under project.description. That's the one I want. So now, when I place one of those parts, whatever's in that cell is going to end up in the part description. See that the material is mapped to project.material. If I wanted these to be a specific color, I could make a color column. Like if I wanted my flanges to be red for some reason, I could make a color column, and then I would map to the right there, member.color. That's the property I would choose. And yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Let's make a column for color. Dope. Color. Color. It's going to be a string. There we go. Now, this one, unfortunately, it doesn't do, like the material column has the drop down that shows you what's actually available in your styles library. Color column doesn't do that. You have to know what the name of your style is. If I just type something in here that doesn't actually exist in my styles library, then it's not going to work. If I wanted it to be, like, I don't know if there's actually a style called red. I'd have to go check that, see exactly what the name of the style that I want is, and I can put it in there. And then just copy that down like I did with the material, like that. Okay, another thing you might want to look at is part number. This is what's going to end up in my part number field. If you have that displayed on your bill of materials, that's what would show up there. So if you have something specific you need show up, you'd want to make sure you set that up. Right now, there's nothing particular. I don't have a part numbering system that I'm using, so I don't really have anything to put in there. So I'm fine with leaving that in there. Just one thing to watch out for is if you are using, I know for sure with the tube and pipe module, if that part number cell is empty, then when you try to create a style in a tube and pipe module, this flange will not show up as available. This family will not show up as available as an available selection. For some reason, when Inventor is looking through those, if it finds that that part number field is empty, then it just doesn't show up. So I've just gotten in the habit of, specifically for pipe fittings, making sure that that's not empty. So I wouldn't necessarily want to I just hit delete. That didn't take it out because this is being controlled by an expression. So if I actually wanted to clear that out, I'd have to take that expression out. But I wouldn't want to do that. I would at least have something in there. And I could, what I've done in the past is I would just type none in there, just so it's not empty. But let me show you. So when I deleted that, and it didn't actually hit the delete key, but it didn't actually clear out that column. Let me show you what you can do is you can actually, even though this is one of my blue columns here that's controlled by an expression, I can actually type something else in there if I want. And what it's going to do, it's kind of hard to see now, but I'm going to go ahead and apply to clear out the yellow. And it's still kind of hard to see. Let me do it on this description. Maybe I'll make something longer so it's easier to see. There we go. All right, now that's easier to see. You can see that's actually black text instead of blue. That's indicating to me that that's actually been overwritten and is no longer being controlled by the formula. But if I can actually restore that back to be driven by the formula by hitting delete, and then it clears out that override and restores it back to being controlled by the expression. So there we go. Let's see. This one, I could actually set that up as an expression. If I wanted them all to just say none, might as well just set that as an expression. And it just controls all of them. You can do that with your material as well. Now see, that actually had an expression in there for steel, and I've overridden it. So if somebody came in here and deleted that, that would clear that back to steel. So rather than doing an override, maybe what I'll do is here change it to A105. Drawback, drawback there is it doesn't give me the drop-down list of the available materials. It is interesting that it goes red though, because it knows that's not a style that's available in my styles library. There we go. Okay, any questions so far?
So copy feature, if you copy a family parent, like say for example you copied a bolt, but you needed to change some of the geometry on that bolt, could you use one of the bolts as a starting point and change some stuff as you go on the geometry itself? What would be the best way to do that?
Yeah, there's a couple ways you can go about that. That's probably a good segue into replacing the family template. So far what we've done for customizing this content is just modify what's in the table. But remember, that's only half of what actually defines this family. Each family is a table and a template. And the template is actually what contains all of the features of that part and the parameters. What we can do in the table is basically change the data that fill out those features and those parameters. But if we wanted to actually change the features and parameters themselves, we can't do it through the table. We have to actually modify the template. And this is definitely a useful skill to have. So let's transition into talking about that. Let's say I'm going to come up with kind of a, I don't know, do we have a good example in mind of what we want to do?
Shoot that net like fill it to it or something.
Okay. Oh, I got an idea. So this is a raised face flange. Let's say we want to make a flat face version. Let's, what we'll want to do, we do want to have a raised face version, so I don't want to edit this family and convert it into a flat face. What I want to do is duplicate this family and then modify that duplicate to make it flat face. So let's go ahead and do that first. So let's do a save copy as, do an independent family, and then I'm going to change this to be a flat face. Everything else is the same. Flat face. Oh, I did not do that right. Here we go. And then I did have these set up to go into a flange folder. So I'm going to follow that here. Oh my gosh. There we go. Okay. Okay, so this is a warning you'll see. If you're doing a shared folder for your families, then this will come up. Basically, this is just Inventor warning you that there is another family somewhere in the Content Center that is also using that same folder. And if that's your intention, which in this case, that's my intention, that's fine. It's just Inventor saying, hey, this is happening. So I can just say, yes, that's fine. That's what I want to do. But that'll come up every time you try to save a family to use a folder that another family is already using. Okay, so I've got a copy of this family. Nope, that's my raised face one. There we go. There's my flat face one. Now I need to actually go in and take that. There's actually a raised face on that flange. Let me show you what I mean. So the way this works, to replace your family template, there's not really a way to just open up that template for that family and make changes to it, just like you can with a table. There's a specific workflow you have to follow. And the way it works is you want to actually place a part from that family. It has to be from that family. I'm going to go ahead and place that, and you want to place it as custom because we have to be able to, we're going to be making changes to this part file that we're placing. And so if we place it as standard, that's going to end up in the standard library folder, and Inventor won't let us change that. So we'll have to place it as custom. In this case, it doesn't matter which one I pick. It might matter for, depending on the part you have, if some of the selections you make are actually suppressing and unsuppressing features, you probably want to pick a part that the features you need to work on are not suppressed. That's not that big of a deal. You can just unsuppress them if you need to. But in this case, it doesn't matter which one I pick. I'm just going to pick a 3-inch. And then I'm going to save, make sure I save this in a place that I can modify it. So I'm just going to dump it in my test folder here. Doesn't matter what you call it. Yeah, it really doesn't matter what you call it. I'm just going to call it test flange. Okay. Oh, hey, it worked. Red actually is. It's in my style library. Okay, now what I want to do is I'm going to actually open up that file, and I'm going to make whatever changes I need to on this part file itself. So the change I want is to convert this from a raised face flange to a flat face flange. So let's see if I can identify where that feature is created. So it looks like it's part of the revolve profile of this sketch. So I'm going to go ahead and just edit this. And there's a parameter, a couple of parameters associated with that. Oh, that's just a user parameter. It's not a named parameter. So I have no qualms about deleting that. And this R, that's going to be the diameter of the raised face, which is not going to apply anymore. So I'm okay deleting that. And I'm going to go ahead and delete these 2 lines and repair my profile by reconnecting those endpoints. And the revolve, oh, the revolved solved just fine. It's just these, they're these work axes and work point are part of the component authoring for tube and pipe module, which we haven't talked about yet. We'll talk about that in a little while if we have time. But basically there was a tube and pipe connection associated with that feature, that raised face feature. Now that that feature's gone, it's lost its definition. So I'm going to have to re-author this. I can go ahead and delete these. And then when I re-author it, it'll create those work features again. Okay, so the features now set up the way that I want. If there were any parameters that I needed to add, this would be the stage that I would do that at. I could go ahead and go into here, edit my parameters. If I needed to add one, I could delete this one since it's not needed anymore. I'll just add one so you can see how that works. And we'll get to that later when it comes back to the actually editing the template. And if you needed to add any like work planes or anything like that, this would be the stage to do it as well. Let's see, like if I have, let's see what face this is on. So I've got a flange on the back face of this. Maybe I want a flange on the front face. Let's see if there's a thickness parameter here. C1, that's the thickness. So I'm going to offset a parameter at C1. There we go. So now I've got a work plane there. I can turn the visibility off or leave it on depending on what my preference is. Okay, so any other changes you need to do other than changing just the values in the table need to be done at this stage. And then last thing I'll probably want to do is fix that authoring. That's going to be on the Manage tab. Then you go. Yeah, we'll cover that more in Tube and Pipe. But just real quick here, I'm going to go into that. So I need to restore that connection. This is a blind flange, so there's just one connection type. And so this is what got lost before. I need to select an edge. Before it was selected on that raised face and that disappeared. So that's why that definition vanished. And neutral, that looks good. Okay. There's my Tube and Pipe authoring. You'll see it made that accessing point again. And okay, so I've got that saved. It's ready to go. Now the next step is I have to go back into my Content Center editor. And now I have to tell Inventor, okay, I need to replace the template that's in there for that family with this new part that I just made. So the way I do that is I right click on that family, replace family template. And then it pulls up a file browser here. I need to go to that folder that had my file in it. Test flange. And there we go. So now the next time I place a part from this family, it's going to be a flat face part. If I had already placed parts from that family that had a raised face on them, then the actual IPT files that got generated locally are going to have that raised face. But so I'll need to actually update those to make sure that they're contain the changes that I just made.
Yeah, so essentially, like what Cameron's saying is there was a change made to the actual model, right? So some features got removed. All of the components that we had dropped prior to this change will have that raised face on them on Cameron's computer, right? They put the part files in some folder location. So what you need to do is you need to get rid of those and replace them with parts made by this model, or else you'll have raised faces.
Yeah, you'll just have the old version of that file.
Yeah.
Now, that stage can be complicated. It's going to depend on whether you're using local content or vaulted content or a network location. So there's a bit that's involved. We could maybe go into that next.
Let's go into
maybe we should
go into from scratch.
Yeah, let's do that first. Let's publish. We're going to create some new stuff first. We might not have time to go over refreshing content.
If that's
we might run out of time.
Anyone online wants to see or anyone here wants to see, let us know, and
We could do an AVA on that or something.
yeah, or something like that. Yeah,
Okay. Did anybody have any questions on what we just went over? Let me go ahead and place one of these so you can see that it should come in as a flat face and with the flange. So I'm going to leave that as standard now. Let's place a 10-inch one. Here we go. Let's see if our raised face is gone, and then our work plane's in there. I should have set that to auto resize because that bugs me, but oh well.
yeah, you're good. We answered all the questions about replacing.
Okay. Just one important thing to remember about replacing a family template is you have to start with a part placed from that family. If I try to replace it with a part that came from another family, Inventor is just going to say, sorry, you can't do that. It's got to be, you have to place as custom from that family. Okay. So that's why I created the copy of the family first. It's because I knew I needed to, when I was going to place a custom part, it needed to be from that family. So the family had to exist first. If I had like made my changes to one from the race face family and then gone in and copied the family to make the new family and tried to replace it from the other one, it just wouldn't work. So that's probably the most important thing to remember there. One other thing I do want to talk about is I did add in a parameter into that part. And this is something that does come up. It's important to know how it works. If you need to add a parameter to a part, you have to do that replace family template step where you actually add the parameter into the template. And then let's say it's something that I do want to be controlled in my table. I need to add a column for that parameter. What did I call it? I called it test. And it was a real. I think about the type of parameter I created was a numeric parameter. Units or inches, I just left the default. This stuff has all got to match what it actually is, otherwise it won't find it and it won't match up. But there we go. Now this is not a property, this is a parameter, so I don't want to use this map here on the properties. I have to actually map it a slightly different way. So right now I've created a column for that, and I can go ahead and put data in there. In fact, for parameters, you have to have data in there. You can't leave this empty for a parameter column. The Inventor won't like that. If you try to save the family table with an empty parameter cell, it's going to basically give you an error message. You can have properties be empty, but you can't have parameters be empty. So I'm just going to put something in there for now so it doesn't complain. Now, right now, if I go ahead and place this part, this column does not match up to that parameter that's in the part itself. They're just two separate things right now. I have to tell Inventor, okay, this column matches up with that parameter. And the way I do that is different than with properties. I have to actually exit out of my table here. I have to right click and go to family properties. And we haven't really talked about the family properties right now. We did talk about family name and the folder. If you ever need to change the folder, that's where you would do it. Go into properties, you can change the folder there. Same with the name. You can change the name there as well if you need to. But what we're looking for here is the parameter mapping. And the first is the category parameters. That's going to apply to the category that this family's in. And that's mostly has to do with the component generator stuff like tube and pipe or frame generator. They're going to have specific parameters that are associated with that category. But what we're looking for is template parameters. So these are going to be the parameters that are stored in that part file, the template that generates the part files. Okay. On the left, it's going to show you a list of the columns that are in your table. On the right is going to be a list of the parameters that are in that template. We're basically just going to match them up. So I'm looking for test. Right now, that column's not mapped to any parameter, but I can go ahead and click that dot button there, pull up a list of, this is going to show me the contents of that template file. Go to my user parameters, there's that test parameter right there. Now those two are linked up. Okay, so now when I actually place this part from the content center, the file gets generated. Whatever value is in that cell for that test parameter is going to actually go into the parameter named test. And then this is that warning about the folder again. So yeah, I'll click through that. Okay. Any questions on that? All right. All right. Let's move on to creating some content from scratch. So let's say there's a part that I need. There's not already a version of it in the out-of-the-box content. If there is a version of the out-of-the-box content, it probably makes sense to just start there so you don't have to redo stuff, right? Save yourself some time. But if, in this case, there's a part that I have that I want this, I want to have a saddle, a pipe saddle. And there aren't any of these in the out-of-the-box content. So this is where your iParts skills come in. And we're not going to talk about how to create iParts today, but I've already basically created the part that I need. I've set it up as an iPart with my iPart table. And there's almost a one-to-one relationship between what you have in your iPart table and what ends up in your family table in the content center, okay? Most of that stuff's just gonna copy straight across. There's a handful of things that won't come across, like the member column. It just kind of becomes obsolete in the content center, but it's a critical part of an iPart table. But other than that, it's pretty much whatever you have in here in your table is gonna end up in your content center table. So you wanna go ahead and do the work ahead of time. Get this set up as best you can up front in the iPart table, just so you don't have to mess with that later. It'll already be set up in your content center when you upload it. So, okay, once you've got your iPart set up, I would say it's a good idea to go ahead and test to make sure every part that can come out of here is good. It's not going to have any errors. And that's basically just a matter of just flipping through and activating each one, making sure your features all look the way they're supposed to. You don't get the red cross error message. Make sure everything looks the way it's supposed to. And this can take some time depending on how many parts you've got in your table, but it's worth it to do it up front, because later when some user tries to use one of those parts, if it's got errors, they might not notice it, or if they do notice it, they might not tell you. They might just live with it, which could cause other problems. Or it might be tricky to figure out exactly what the problem is. And usually to fix something like that, it's usually a matter of you're going to have to go and replace the family template to fix something, which then you're going to have to do refreshing all your standard content that's already been used. So it kind of has a cascading effect. So it's best to find all the problems here, fix them before you ever load it into the content center. And the best way to do that is just go through and make sure they're all loading the way they're supposed to. Okay. I've already done that, so I'm not going to take your time to go ahead and do that. So this thing is basically ready to go. You also want to consider if you're creating a component that's going to be used by tube and pipe, bolted connection generator, or frame generator, then you'll want to do the authoring before we put it into Content Center. So that's going to be on your Manage tab. And depending on the type of component, I've already authored this as tube and pipe. That's already set up and ready to go. So, but that's a step you want to make sure you do ahead of time, because if you don't do it here, you're going to have to, in order to do that after it's published, you have to do a replace family template workflow in order to do that authoring later. So it's best to do that up front. Okay, once it's ready to go, then what you do to get it into the Content Center is you go to your Manage tab, go to the Content Center bar here, and we're going to publish a part. This is not a feature, this is a part, so that's the one we want. And then it's going to kind of step through this little publishing guide. It's going to help us guide through the different steps involved in making sure this ends up where it's supposed to go. First step here is to choose the library that you want to publish it to. It has to be a custom library, of course. And since we only have one, that's fine. That's the one it's going to go to. Select a language. I've never had to change that, so I don't know what scenario you'd have. I mean, obviously you use the language you're using, but it should just default to that. Okay, click next. Then you have to choose a category to publish it to. Here's the thing about the authoring. The authoring actually takes care of most of the steps of this publishing process. It already knows what category to go to because I've authored this as a tube and pipe part, and I chose it to be a branch component, so it knows to go into the branches folder. I didn't have to select that. If I had not authored it, then it wouldn't default. You'd have to tell it which folder it would have to go to. But since I've authored it, it's already there, so I can just click through most of this. The next step is going to be category parameters. And again, this is what I was talking about earlier. Different categories have different parameters that define the parts that are inside of them. And this mostly has to do with the component generator tools like tube and pipe and frame generator. And again, since I've already authored it, this is already filled out with the ND outlet is the nominal size. The yellow ones, the ones that are, I don't know if you can see that, kind of the background of that cell is a yellowish. Those are ones that are required. Those have to be filled out in order for you to publish this content center. The rest of the white ones are optional. And because the authoring fills this out for me, so I don't have to, I'm not going to worry about these other ones that didn't get filled out unless I had a need to. But if you haven't authored, I would have to actually choose what column in my table is going to match up to this specific category parameter, the size in this case. It's going to be my outlet. So that's filled out. The next is we have to define which columns are our key columns. And this is going to come from my actual content center table. I've already defined, or not content center table, sorry, my iPart table. I've already defined key columns in my iPart. And so those are the ones that are automatically coming across here, these two here. Let me back up just a second so I can show you what I mean there. If I go into my table here, you'll see these two columns have this little key icon that indicates that these are my key columns. I've defined those as key columns, which basically means I've right-clicked, hit key. 1 and 2 are already defined. I could define this H column as a third key. I'm not going to do that, but that's how those key columns were defined. You don't have to define key columns for iParts, but if you're going to be publishing this iPart to the content center, you want to do that. Go ahead and define them here, because it makes more sense to see the table itself and do that here than to try and do it in that dialog later. Because content center files need to have a key column where iParts don't. So it's best to go ahead and do this ahead of time before you start to publish. Go back through, get back to where we're at. Okay, so since I had already defined the key columns in my iPart table, those are the ones that came across. If I hadn't, then I'd have to go through and pick at least one for a key column. But the number of key columns is going to depend entirely on what kind of part you're defining. We can talk about how to choose key columns at another time. If we do like an iPart training, we can talk about it then. It can be tricky to figure out exactly which columns are key columns sometimes. But since these are ready to go, I've already got my key columns. I'm going to go ahead and click next. And now we have to choose a name for our family that's going to end up in the content center. And the name of the file is what ends up here by default. I don't really want that. I want to follow my family naming convention that I've set up. So I'm going to call this a saddle That's kind of what I've got in my description down there. So I'm going to kind of follow that. Set all clamp on. Schedule 80. Now, I don't want to put any size specific information in the family name because this family contains all of the sizes. But I do want to put socket. That's the type of connection. Abbreviate that. And then probably my material, PVC. Okay. And I'll take the size info out of my description. And I have a saddle folder. Okay, I could choose a standard organization if I want. All that's in there right now is ANSI, but I could add whatever I want in there. My standard. If you just type whatever, you can put whatever you want in there. I'm going to go ahead and set that as ANSI. Manufacturer, this is based on a Spears PVC fitting. So I'm going to go ahead and put Spears in there. The drop-down doesn't show anything. The drop-down will show you, it will list out any that are already in your content center. So you could, instead of having to type it out every time, you can just pick one that's already there. But since I haven't ever added any manufacturers, that's going to be empty. So I'm going to type Spears there. If I knew the standard this was based on, the specific standard, I could pick that. In this case, I don't know. I know that's the material standard, but there might be like a size standard. I'm just going to leave that blank. I can come back and add it later if I need to. And I'll leave the standard revision blank. The thumbnail, it's going to automatically generate a thumbnail for you. But sometimes these thumbnails, the purpose of a thumbnail is to quickly, like when you're looking at your list of content center files and you see a whole bunch of families all listed out, you can visually quickly find the files that the families that you're looking for. But if they all just look blah and generic and the same, then that's not really useful. I actually take a little bit of time when I'm creating a new content center family to make a nice thumbnail. Usually what I'll do is I'll set the background to be white. I'll take a screenshot of a part. For a part like this, that the material that it's made out of is really dark. It's kind of a dark gray. It kind of washes out some of the details, makes it harder to see. So I might actually make that a lighter gray so the details stand out a little bit better. I might take it from a different angle so I can see the connection type or whatever. I don't know. I just put a little bit of thought into making a nicer thumbnail just because I know that it's going to help me later when I'm working. You know, I'm in a good groove and I'm working quickly and I need to just open up Content Center, quickly find a part, drop it in, and not spend time looking through all the hundreds of parts that are listed or hundreds of families. So, in fact, I think I've actually got one. Yeah, I prepared one for this. So I'm just going to go grab that one. Nope, that's the one I'm looking at. I need to go find documents, activity. There we go. See, I've made one there. It's got a white background. I made the color lighter. It's not as quite a dark gray. And I put a little border around it. It helps it stand out in the giant list of the sea of family icons, thumbnails. And then that's it. You just hit publish, and it's going to create that family in the Content Center, generate the table, upload the template. So let's go take a look at it. Let's go into my editor. And this is the first time I've ever added anything to the branches, so it's added that category for me. There's my little thumbnail. You can actually change that view. We haven't talked about that yet. Right now, this is on thumbnail view. Let me do merged so you can see what else is in there. But there's also a list view and then a details view. So the details is basically the list view, but it shows the family description as well. The list just shows the family name. And I actually find it useful to switch back and forth between these. Because like I said, the thumbnail view, you can quickly visually identify parts that you need, but sometimes you can't see the full family name, like right there. You can see where it only fits so much. If you select it, it'll show the entire family name, but sometimes it's kind of a pain to like be selecting a bunch of them. If you need to find something by family name, it's better to switch to the list view where you can actually see the full family name and just go down and find the one you're looking for. So yeah, I switch back and forth quite a bit depending on what I'm looking for. But there's my new family. It should be good to go. There's not much more you should need to do, but you could, if you needed to edit the table and come in here and maybe adjust your file naming. That's probably something you can do that ahead of time in your iPart table, but it's also easy enough to do here after the fact. You could, that's already got a description, but this is just static text right now. I could set up an expression to build that description like I did for the other family, and that's something you'd have to do after the fact. The expressions won't come over, except for some of these get added. These were not columns in the file name and designation, were not columns in my iPart table. Those actually got created when I published it. Inventor added those columns in and filled them out with his expressions when I published it. So that's the basic gist of publishing your own content. Is there any questions?
Cameron, again, thanks for being here today with us. Everyone on the line, thank you for attending as well. With that, I'll go ahead and close the session out, and we'll see everyone next month.
Bye, everyone.